This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. On the afternoon of Tuesday, September 24th, 1974, a 13-year-old girl named Cassie Riley was murdered in Union City, California. She was drowned in a creek in Casa Verde Park. The police arrested an 18-year-old security guard named Marvin Mutch. The following year, at the age of 19, he was convicted of the murder and sentenced to 7 years to life in prison. Marvin was placed in San Quentin State Prison, which sits on the bay right across from San Francisco and across from Berkeley, where I was growing up at the time. Marvin was denied parole more than 20 times. And he says there are two reasons for that. One is that he became a leader of the prisoners' rights movement in California, and the second is that he always refused to admit that he was guilty of the crime. Marvin spent 41 years in San Quentin. He was released in 2016 at the age of 60. He still maintains that he's innocent of the crime. And the California prison system, it looks a lot different than it did in 1975, in large part because of him. This is my interview with Marvin Mutch. So I'm sitting across the table from Marvin Mutch, who a year and a half ago, is this right? You were in San Quentin. Mm-hmm. Right across the bay from where we are. We're in San Francisco right now. And when I was growing up, I lived in Berkeley, born and raised in Berkeley. You're from the East Bay too, a little further south in Union City, but Point Reyes was my favorite place over in Marin County. And to get there from Berkeley, you had to go over the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge, which of course goes right past San Quentin. And every time I saw that prison, I would think about it and think about who was in there. And you're the first person I've ever met who was in there as I drove by all those years growing up here. And so I am very thankful that you're here and I get to find out much more about what really goes on inside that place. But there's another very big, very amazing story attached to you that I want to get into as well. So a year and a half ago, you were in that place and you had been in that place for 40 years.
Right.
So you were put in San Quentin when you were 19 years old, right?
Right.
In 1975, when I was 10 and you were 19.
Right. I actually paroled from the California Medical Facility 2008. I experienced a very violent incident and ended up going to the medical facility, but we can get into that as I go into the history.
Right. But so you have spent your entire adult life until a year and a half ago in San Quentin.
Yes.
Right. You were living with your parents at the time of your sentencing, correct?
My mother.
Your conviction. Your mother, right. So yeah, you had never lived as an adult until you were 60 years old. You're now 61, is that right?
I'm 61 years old.
Yeah. Yeah, so that in itself is remarkable, regardless of what the crime or the alleged crime or the charges were, any of it, right? And we're certainly going to talk about that, what that means. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the first thing I was curious about with you, right? I mean, sort of like you've lived in a different world, really your entire conscious adult life. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden you're here, but you were always right there, right next to me, right next to all of us. You can see San Quentin. You can pretty much throw a rock onto San Quentin from that bridge. So almost everyone in the Bay Area sees that bridge, sees that prison on an almost daily basis. You can see it from anywhere in the Bay too, pretty much, because it's right there on the water. Okay, so do you mind if we go back over
your case and at least give the basic facts so people understand
Sure.
the context. And now what another remarkable thing about you, unusual thing about you, is that you have maintained your innocence.
Yes, except for a small period of time in front of the parole board midway through that process.
Right. But that we'll get into that. But basically, you've always believed and said, essentially,
I've always said that. Yes,
that you were innocent. You did not commit this crime. Okay. So can we talk about what the crime was?
It was a first-degree murder in Union City. A young girl named Cassie Riley was killed at the park.
She was 13.
Right. And I ended up being convicted for the crime.
And you were 18 at the time, correct?
Exactly. Just turned 18. Just got out of high school.
And you were working as a security guard?
Yep. Just got the job 2 weeks before.
And you have always admitted that you were not only at the park that day, but you also talked to Cassie Riley, but that you then went home and had nothing to do with what happened to her. Right. She was found drowned, I believe, in the creek.
Right.
And partially with her clothes sort of partially off, right?
Right.
She wasn't raped, but there was some sort of sexual assault.
I guess what the criminologist said is that the person that committed the crime had some sort of personal animus, and this was a thing that they ascribed to humiliating the body. Some kind of weird thing that happens when somebody who's vicious enough to kill somebody. This is the end step to that process, and it has to be somebody that's personally involved with the person. So there was a humiliation thing, an anger thing.
Right. So we'll get into the details of the case, but I just want people to understand what's happening here, the basic story. And you were arrested and convicted and sentenced a year later, at the age of 19, to 7 years to life, which ended up, for various reasons we'll get into, being 40 plus years in San Quentin.
That's right.
And the entire time, as I said, you've maintained your innocence, and you were released on parole. You're now on parole, and you were released a year and a half ago. Okay. So the other thing about your case that's a bit unusual, I think, is that you're one of the Innocence Project cases. Your case was taken up by the Innocence Project, which is
the Golden Gate University Innocence Project.
Right. It's part of the National Innocence Project. Barry Shuck's
organization. They're all interconnected. They're a part of the Northern California Innocence Project.
Right. And so I think most Innocence Project cases involve DNA.
Yeah.
Right. And in your case, though, there was no DNA.
No.
There never has been. So
right. It wasn't a case where DNA was involved.
So is it fair to say, and we'll get into the details later, but is it fair to say that your case is ambiguous, or more ambiguous than most other Innocence Project cases of people who have been exonerated?
Right.
Okay. So today you would admit, right, there is nothing you can point to as clear evidence that you were innocent.
Right. But the way the Innocence Project looks at it is that you would think that the one thing that you would need to send somebody to prison for 41 years is evidence that they committed the crime. And so it's actually the opposite. It's the way I look at it is that there's nothing they can point to. And this is the standard in this country. You're innocent until proven guilty. And at that time, and even today, given the inflammatory nature of the crime, you actually don't need any evidence. You just inflame the jury, or you inflame the judge, and to send a person off to prison, and without evidence.
Right. I was going to say that it's ambiguous in both ways. It's ambiguous that you were innocent, and it's ambiguous that you were guilty. Right. There is no, as far as I understand this, there was no evidence that was not circumstantial. There were no fingerprints, am I right? Or anything like that?
No fingerprints, no footprints, no nothing.
And no eyewitnesses.
No eyewitnesses.
Right. So it's a really unusually, I would say, ambiguous case, especially for a murder case, right? But from both sides. So it's interesting, right? I mean, I will tell you, Marvin, like I I mostly believe you, but I can't say that I will be 100% convinced. I can't be. And I don't think you should expect anyone to be.
You can't be.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, if I
Because
saw DNA, then it'd be a different story.
I mean, just look at recent history to things that astound you. Today, on a daily basis, I'm astounded at what's going on. I turn on the TV and I'm astounded by what I see. And so I could have probably said years ago that I was 100% sure that we would not be seeing what we're seeing today. And I'm finding that I'm wrong because it's happening. And things are happening that people who have been asleep for a long time are now waking up saying, it wasn't a nightmare. This is happening. This is real. And
yes, this is true. We get proven wrong about things constantly.
Exactly.
Not just as individuals, but as entire societies.
Exactly.
Things that we were sure were true are now, we are sure they are false.
Last week, the people in Hawaii woke up. They thought they were going to get blown up.
Yeah. Yeah. So you don't mind that I am going to harbor some piece of skepticism about you and about that? That's only one question I have for you. I mean, that's only one question, in your case and in your story, right? Whether you were guilty or not is just one question. There's many others that are maybe even more interesting and important. But do you mind that I have some skepticism about it?
I don't care.
Yeah. Good.
I listen, when I went into the prison system, you find that you are defined by your conviction. Everybody that you see from the day you walk into the prison, every committee, every classification, every counselor, every person that opens up your file, you are that conviction. Yeah. You are defined by that. And people tend to reify a person's offense and make that an attribute of the person. And it's very unfair. But for 41 years, I would say, well, I don't know what to tell you about that because I wasn't there. I didn't commit the crime. And it's like, yeah. Okay. So,
I love that you used the word reify just there, because that's what I was thinking about when I was studying your case and your story. It's so strange to be talking about something that happened in 1975 still, or 74, was it? 74, the crime?
74.
74, right? And as if it's what really matters right now, and that's what reification is. It's the making of an idea into material reality in the present.
Exactly.
And I would imagine that's been your life. Well, you're sort of saying that, for the last 40 some years, is that thing that happened when you were 18 in 1974 is a real material reality every day of your life.
Certainly.
Imagine that. I mean, even if you're guilty, even if you were 100% guilty, that's quite something. I mean, to live every day with your material reality defined by this thing that happened that long ago, that at this point could be treated, right, simply as an idea, as a concept.
Well, because it's so monumentous that no matter what you do, if that is the case, no matter what you do, you never overcome that. You're always in the shadow of that thing. Yeah. And so it stunts you, just like anything else. Trying to grow in the shadows, it stunts you.
Yeah, you're a murderer.
Yeah, you're a murderer. You're defined by that.
And when I say that, I mean that in one real way, which is that people will think of you, at least on some level, and I'm admitting right now that I do on some level, still think of you as a murderer. Even if I were, but that's so strange though, even if it were true, and I knew it was true, that you did kill Cassie Riley in 1974, it would still be sort of strange for your identity to still be defined as such.
Certainly.
Now, in 2017, when you're 61
Certainly.
years old. Yeah. Okay, so there's so many questions, as I said. Whether you're guilty or not is certainly an interesting one, and that's, but there are other questions. And one of the things that I found also just fascinating about you is your life story and your childhood and how you sort of ended up being a suspect. I mean, it sounds like, according to you and your lawyers, that the police kind of had you in mind when they found out about the crime, right? So
right.
How did you get to the age of 19? How did you get from birth to being sort of in the minds of the police in Union City, California? Like, where did you start?
Oh, well, I always start with my mother because she was born in Hebron in then Palestine.
Palestine.
Yeah.
Yet another unusual thing about you, right?
Exactly.
We don't see a lot of prisoner stories, about Jews,
Right?
Right? These days.
Right. These days.
Yeah.
Jews have a long history of being prisoner.
Yeah, but just not lately. Not in this country. Yeah.
So she was a Holocaust survivor. She's 82 years old now. And
where was she from originally?
she was born in 1935 in Hebron.
Oh,
in Palestine.
So she was not in Nazi Germany, though.
No.
Okay.
And her mother was Jewish. She lived in Hebron, and her father came from Romania and met her mother. They were married. She was born, and in 1937, he took her and her mother to Romania.
Oh.
And the war broke out, and they got trapped there.
I see. Okay.
And by 1941, the war had overtaken them, and it was, they killed her parents, and she hid in the basement of a church, and she was found by another family who took her in. Within months, that family was overrun, and they all ended up in camps. And so she, at the end of the war, she was liberated from the camp, and she was brought to Yakima, Washington as an orphan at 8 years old. She stayed there in the orphanage for 10 years, and she left the orphanage. She met my father, Howard. He was a Baptist minister, had a tent show, go out and, do the Baptist thing, heal people and that kind of stuff, which was really odd. This Baptist minister and this Jewish girl. But I was born and
in Yakima?
In Yakima, Washington. And by the time I was 2, my sister was born, Valerie. And my mother and father got a divorce. I mean, he loved her, I'm sure, but he just he could not dispel the ghosts of her past. She just had a lot of damage from what she experienced as a child, and we're finding out. I've read and I've lived the fact that trauma is intergenerational. Her trauma from the camps affected her children as well. And so she ended up getting married to another guy, Emmanuel, had 2 more girls, my sisters. So I have 3 sisters. Manuel, again, he was with her quite a while, but again, he could not overcome the effects of a life robbed of, love and nurture and innocence, So, and they were divorced. She had a lot of medical problems and other things that plagued her life, and I was in foster care quite a bit. So I ended up going when I was like 4 or 5. I went to foster home for the first time, and I was crying and upset about being left there. And the woman there told me, "Stop crying." I said, "Well, I want to go to my mother." And she said, "Well, your mother's dead. She's not coming back. This is where you're going to be staying." So 8 months later, when my mother finally came to get me, I thought she was like a ghost or something. I went under the house, and they had to call the fire department to get me out from under the house. And my mother took me in the car to where she was living in up on Mount Hamilton in San Jose. And as soon as I got out of the car, I ran away. She had to call the police. And I ended up as a ward of the court. By the time I was 6 years old, I was a ward of the court as a child out of control of their guardian. And so that was my entrance into the juvenile justice system. And after that, I was in many foster homes. A lot of them, the people that ran the foster homes had no business having care and custody of children. It was awful. And I eventually ended up in the boys' ranch. My mother tended to, after Manuel, she tended to gravitate towards abusive relationships. And it wasn't until her fourth marriage, I was in the boys' ranch. I was taken out of the boys' ranch and sent back home. And the guy she was with did not want children there, so I got sent back. And that was probably the worst one for me, because I knew why I was going back, why I was going back to the ranch. And I ended up in a group home called Because of Youth, Boy. In that group home, this actually ties right in with one of the things I'm working on right now, is how talking to lawmakers about how the children's shelters and the other group homes feed young people to the adult criminal system. They feed them to them. This system is self-perpetuating. It eats its young. Yep. And it creates at one level what it needs at the next. And so this one group home I was in early on, every time something would happen in the neighborhood, the guy who was the director of the group home would allow the police to come and take all the boys, 14 or 15 of us, down to the police station. They'd put us in rooms, and they'd have victims of crimes look in the window at us and see if they recognize anybody, put us in lineups. And I think I was maybe 11 or 12 at the time, but there was 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids there. And so it was quite a lineup of guys that they would bring down there, some very small kids. But every time that they did that, which was a dozen times in my case, they would put in your juvenile file, on this date, Mutch was looked at as a suspect in a robbery or in a burglary or in crimes against children or in this assault. And so later on, it proved to be a big piece of the puzzle when they said, this guy's arrest history really looks like this is the guy we're looking for right here. Look at all of this stuff. None of that stuff I was ever arrested for. None of that I ever spent more than a half hour down at the police station with everybody else being looked at and being let go. But our juvenile files say what they say. On this date, burglary. On this date, assault. On this date, robbery. And there's no disposition or anything else. So years later, when people look at this file, there's no explanation there. There's no fact that he was in a boys' home. So you just have this screwed up file. And so a lot of the young people that end up in youth authority or adult prison end up there primarily because of their background. And that background is in question. I'm here to tell you that it's a very loose standard in documenting things in that file.
What did you think of authority when you were a kid?
Well, I thought, because I was in a position where I had no say in where I lived or what happened to me, I was like this kid that was on a plane, at 30,000 feet, and the adults are all jumping out with parachutes saying, have fun flying a plane. And I don't know how to fly a plane. So I always felt betrayed. I always felt that I was inconsequential. I didn't matter. And so if I didn't matter, what I didn't matter as well. And
I was going to say, it's a good way to create a criminal.
It certainly is.
Were you? Did you commit those crimes?
No. I became an injustice collector. It actually worked. What
does that mean?
I started. I've always had this curse that I was able to see when something isn't fair, and to the point where it drove me. I remember this one. I remember when the earliest recollection I had when I felt I needed to fix things. I needed to try and make things right, at least in my world. I was in one of the foster homes I was in. They had this woman and her husband had two natural daughters, and they had a foster daughter, and they had a foster son, which was me. And I use the word son and daughter loosely when it comes to the fosters, because that's just what they're called. This is your foster son. Right. I don't think son ever enters into it in their minds. It's a paycheck for most of them. But this young girl, she wanted this doll that talks. It was called Chatty Cathy. She wanted this Chatty Cathy doll. And she talked about it incessantly. Christmas was coming. And from, mid-year to Christmas, she talked about this doll. Christmas came. The two natural daughters got this talking doll, and she got a doll that had the eyes closed when you laid it down. That's basically what it did. You could move its arms and legs.
I remember Chatty Cathy, yes.
Yeah, but she didn't get the doll she wanted. She was crying. She was heartbroken. And I remember it really affected me. And I thought, how unfair is this? Because everybody knows that she wanted this doll. And I just thought it was unfair. And as a young child, I didn't know what else to do but to try and talk her into not being sad. So I told her, look, your doll is better than her doll anyway. And she said, oh, no, my doll doesn't talk. I said, yeah, but your doll listens. And so after that, every time she was upset, she would set that doll up and she would just pour her heart out. She carried it around by the head and she would talk to it all the time. It was her favorite thing. Her doll listened to her, and I think it really helped her. But I realized at that time that there are things that you can do. Later on, it helped develop my the whole Tikkun Olam thing for me. Where
what's that?
It means repair the world,
right.
And
in Hebrew,
yeah. The Talmud says that man was created to complete the creation, to finish it, and our job, the vessel is broken, and as we know, and our job as human beings is to find the shards of that broken vessel and bring them back and try and make something whole. And from an early age, I always felt that drive to fix things that are wrong. And it was only compounded and solidified when I was convicted and sent to prison. I mean, from the very beginning, I was an activist and organizer inside, and there was so much wrong, so much to do in that environment that for an injustice collector, it's almost overwhelming.
So this was the 1960s and early 1970s in the Bay Area, and I was growing up, more or less the same generation, and I was here. That's when social justice was in the air,
right?
And here, were you interested in larger questions of social justice? than, the foster.
It really hadn't.
Kid
It
and
really
her doll?
hadn't developed. I mean, when I was 14 years old, I hitchhiked to Woodstock, and
It's precocious.
it's probably yeah. I don't know if you could do that today. You'd
No.
end up dead in a ditch someplace. Or
Well, you just wouldn't get there. No one would pick you up.
yeah. So, but I hitchhiked to Woodstock, and well, it's probably the most miserable time I've ever had. I drank out of this Red Mountain jug when I got there, and it had 19 kinds of hallucinogenics in it. So I was walking around tripping out at 14. There's, it's raining, it's miserable, muddy. Everybody's looking for the pig ranch, and I go to the pig ranch. There's food over there, and so I'm like, hey, where's the pig ranch? There's topless people and a clown walking around, Wavy Gravy.
I've known Wavy Gravy. Yes, I used to go to a summer camp that was right next to his, and we used to hang out with Wavy Gravy.
It got super paranoid for a while. I said, the pigs are seeding the clouds, man. They're making it rain. So now I'm thinking the police are making it rain, and so
it's the origin of the chemtrail conspiracy theory, maybe.
Exactly.
Okay.
So I met some people there and they actually gave me a ride all the way back to San Francisco that I was in touch with for several years after that. Very political. I ended up going to San Francisco State. I was involved with them in digging up the front of the college, filling a brand new GM car full of grapes.
The grape boycott?
Yeah.
So my parents were intimately involved in that grape boycott with the United Farm Workers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we actually sold wax at the car with a sledgehammer for $1 a piece, and people would give you $1 and you can hit the car with the sledgehammer, and then we buried the car. It's still buried in front of San Jose State, in support of the
I was marching as a
workers.
10-year-old or 9-year-old for the United Farm Workers in places like Salinas and Modesto. I think at the very same time around that great boycott. Yeah.
And then we attended quite a few rallies under Black Panthers and that whole Feed the Community thing. It was a confusing time for me, because I knew that there was some need for healing, but more importantly, need for action to compel that healing. But it just wasn't apparent to me, even as I was involved in those things, how this is going to change anything. We buried a car with grapes in it. I mean, I know we're making a statement, but shouldn't we be trying to get lawmakers to write some kind of legislation? And so even as a young person, I was not satisfied with those kind of actions. But even today, my wife and I were scheduled to go to this next Women's March. It's the anniversary, and we've been at the very first Women's March after the election. We went to that, and I think there's a need to at least make an appearance to let people see just how many people are dissatisfied, and maybe your voice will be heard. I think this phone, the smartphones and the computer, the social media has actually damaged our political arm, our action arm. When somebody sees something that they're upset with, what the latest insult to our world or to our very being, they'll push the dislike button or a little mad face. and they've felt like they've done something. Okay, there, I sent a mad face. Well, you really didn't do anything. You clicked a button, and it's taking the place of people mobilizing. Back in the 60s, we took it to the streets, taking it to the streets, you know? Yeah. It doesn't happen very much anymore because people feel satisfied with this click of the button. And we have to be very careful that that does not become our choice of mass protest. I see here there was 22,300,000 clicks. Yeah, but if there was 23 million people hit the streets, that would be really something.
Oh, indeed. It could change the world. It could stop a war, for instance.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, I'm just really struck by the fact that you were aware of social injustice, even as a child because of your mother's history. And how old were you when I assume she was telling you this stuff about the Holocaust, that you were aware of the Holocaust at a very early age. Was she telling you at the time?
No, she didn't talk about it quite a bit. What I found out about my mother, the history that I posted on my Facebook page, we found out through research, and we had to find the orphanage, find her.
So she never mentioned it to you?
She didn't talk about it a lot. As a matter of fact, the number that she had, she cut off. When she was young, she cut it off. And do
you know what her maiden name was?
Ibrahim. Alice Ibrahim. And I guess in English it would be Abraham.
So when did you do that research?
Probably the bulk of the research. I already had some. I had somebody doing it for me while I was inside. And that's during a period I was trying to actually help her to understand these unhealthy relationships she was having. While I was inside, one of her husbands threw her across the room through a door and broke her hip. And her explanation to me was, well, it was my fault. I did A, B, or C. I'm going, no, it's not your fault. And so I started reading to try and figure out what is this that she's doing to herself. And I read this book called Women Who Love Too Much. And I actually got her to read it, and it changed her. She ended up marrying this guy, a retired car salesman, treated her like a princess. She loved this guy, and he loved her. And I'm just, if nothing else would have went right in my life after that, that would have been one of the things that I felt, okay, everything else has been worth it for me because she's now happy. And she still has these ghosts and demons that haunt her life, but not to the extent that she would put herself in a position where she's going to be abused. And I'm thankful that I was in prison when all that was happening, because I don't know. I'm not a violent person. I never was. When in prison, oddly enough, the most violent place that you can find yourself in, everybody's got weapons. Everybody's violence is the curative for everything. I was the guy who mediated the grievances and mediated the disputes. I was the guy who, when we were locked down because somebody was stabbed by one faction or another, would go out and talk to the factions and see if we can't get everybody to meet some middle ground, and so we can come off the lockdown and get back to our program.
Yeah, where did that come from in you? What do you think?
Don't know. It's not, I think I've always remembered it being there. This type of need to.
Well, maybe it was from wanting to save your mother.
It could be. It could be. I just know it's been
and to get her back,
familiar companion. My whole life, I've always remembered having this feeling that this isn't fair, and what can I do about it? But what's frustrating as a child is that question never gets answered, because you don't have the power to affect change. as a child, you're saying, what can I do about it? And the answer always comes back like a echo. Nothing. You can do nothing about it.
You know why? Because you're a prisoner when you're a child.
Exactly. So, and it actually drove the negative thought patterns that I grew up with. It's like, fuck everybody, you know? And that conflicted on a personal level with me. How can I say fuck everybody when I'm concerned about what's happening to everybody?
Yeah, you didn't say fuck everybody.
No, I didn't. But it comes. It's almost schizophrenic. You know?
There's a conflict in you.
Yeah, there is. It's internal. It's one party that's saying, "You're a fool.
Yeah.
You're a fool. Look what your life is." Yeah. And then there's a point where even there's this self-talk where you're mocking yourself. Yeah. So what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you must have had conflicted feelings about your mother.
I did. I felt on more than one occasion that she did not do enough to shield me. The way other mothers shield their children. I didn't, and until I was maybe 12 or 13, I started realizing that I'm being unfair because long before I came into the picture, she was haunted and broken. And, sometimes people just can't fix themselves. Sometimes they don't even know they're broken.
Yeah. So you believe that comes from her deeper history in Holocaust Europe, right? And the state, on the other hand, I imagine that wasn't their justification for taking you from her.
Right.
I'm assuming they diagnosed her, as having a mental illness. Is that right? Or what was their justification for placing you in foster care?
She didn't deal with stress well, and she would weep incessantly when she got super stressed out, and they felt that was a nervous breakdown.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so they would say, "Oh, she needs a timeout, so we're going to put her kids in foster care." That only happened a couple of times. Most of her problems were medical.
Physical. Medical.
Yeah. She had a lot of physical problems, and she had quite a few operations and other things that.
But I'm assuming they deemed her, quote, unfit, right? That's what the terminology was at the time.
No, they deemed me incorrigible.
Oh, it was you?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. They said that I was a minor out of control of his guardian. Because I ran away a lot. I used to run away when I didn't like something. I learned it in foster care. If I did not like where I was at, I would run away. And where I was going, I don't know.
So what did she not shield you from?
I don't know. Don't let them take me to the foster home. Okay. That kind of thing. And I used to run away. As a matter of fact, I was in this one foster home where the guy, if he didn't like something that you did, he would call you over to him. And when you got within arm's length, he would knock you out, physically knock you out. And when you woke up, he'd say, "Take your ass to your room." And he did that to me 3 or 4 times. And I took an ashtray one day and threw it through the glass door of his gun case. And he picked up the phone and he called juvenile authorities, said, "Come get this motherfucker out of my house." And they came and got me. So I learned that if I didn't like where I was and I couldn't run away, I would go off. I would just go off. I would break something or kick a hole in the wall or something, and they would take me away. And this would all add to my infamy in my file. And it was sad because looking back on it years later, if I was a person completely divorced from my experiences and I read that, I would not know what to think about that young person. But I'm not divorced from that. And when I look at that, it's the essence. It's the central core of what I ended up becoming inside. I had that same attitude when I was in the joint and I was confronting situations in the joint, but it wasn't, you couldn't break something. You couldn't, because you'd end up in the hole, you'd end up in administrative segregation. But just as impactful as breaking the glass door on the gun case is when you turn and you tell the person with the keys and the club and the pepper spray and the gun just what you think about what they just did or what they're going to do. And it wounds them. You talking to me, inmate? Yeah, I am. And they could not believe it. I found that the worst thing you could do is question their authority, which turns out to be a bad thing when you're trying to get paroled from prison because they say he's got a problem with authority. And I was able to reconcile that midway through maybe my 20th year in prison. I was like, I'm getting in these recs with staff and they're writing me up and it's going into my file. So what I figured out was that I have to stop focusing on the individual that's I'm dealing with. I have to look at the uniform, the badge and the patch and understand that I have to respect that power and authority and give it its due, because without some recognition of that, you're not going to function in that environment. So I divorced myself from the person that's wearing the uniform and looked to the uniform saying, okay, you're the cop. It's how you feel. It's the way it is. And then I would just take it to litigation. Next thing they know, they're being served at the warden's level with a habeas corpus and it's me again, talking about the things that they did.
So you said you broke things when you were a kid. And you know what? I broke things too. In fact, I've been breaking things ever since I was 5 years old when my parents divorced. And I had all this anger and rage. And my means of outlet or expression or just release was to break objects, inanimate objects. And I remember I once took an axe handle to a fence and broke a hole in the fence. And I just every year since I was 5 years old until maybe last year, I think was the last time I broke something. And I'm 52 years old.
Wow.
Oh yeah. I still have, when I get very, very upset still, that's the first thing I want to do. I don't know why it's that. Maybe I inherited it from my father, but I've never hit anybody out of anger or, it's never been a person who's been an
nor
object.
have I.
It's interesting, but boy, there's a lust for me to break something, smash something. I used to have fantasies about smashing an entire wall in the apartment I was living in with my wife because I would get so angry about her and my life then. I had these constant recurring fantasies about smashing, I don't know why, this whole wall that separated the bedroom from the main room. I don't know what that represents, Dr. Freud, but so when you said that, the thing about taking the ashtray and smashing the gun case, I was right with you in that moment, because that is pretty much what I would have done. I mean, that sounded just like me, but never a person, never directed that violence. So I consider myself to be a violent person because that is violence and it's scary. And I've been with people who have been scared when I do that. And I sort of in the moment, I don't understand it because I say, what? I'm not being violent against you. Mm-hmm. But of course it's scary. It's taken me a long, long time to understand
it's all
that.
about fear. Look, when you see the old movies about the settlers coming across in their wagons and going across the plains, and they come across this, these lances with skulls on top and feathers hanging off, and they go, oh, we can't go that way because there's these things here. We can't go that way. The indigenous people put those up because they were scared of these people that were coming, and they put them up to keep them away from them.
Right.
When you get into prison, the first thing guys do is rip off their shirts on the yard and throw them on the bench, and they walk around with their tattoos showing their dragons and their flames and their lightning bolts and their swastikas and their all the rest of that. Those are their lances and skulls. And people see that, go, oh, don't mess with them. He's got a dragon on his chest, he's got a Viking on his arm. And it works the same way. Those things are put on, I believe, because of the insecure being that they are. Sure. They come together in this huge pack, and they all sport these tattoos, and they display them so other people know to stay away from you. Mm-hmm. And I think it comes from that same base of fear. I've always figured that kind of thing out pretty readily, and it gets me in trouble with some of the people. When I left the last juvenile facility that I was in, I went from because of youth to a couple others. And the last one I was in, the boys ranch, they had this system where when you came in, you were in B section. B section meaning that you were classified as B, A, B, C, D, but they had D, C, B, A, and home section. Your job in the boys ranch, the William James Boys Ranch in Morgan Hill, was to go from B to A and from A to home section. You had to work your way out. Mm-hmm. And you did this. You went out with the crews and you worked on Farmer Bill's farm. You dug ditches and pulled weeds and, picked vegetables and other things. Right.
Oh, you were doing some labor there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't entirely voluntary.
No. I guess the state was making great money on these kids being sold as labor to the local ranchers and farmers.
How is that not slavery?
It is slavery.
How do they ever think that that's not slavery?
It is slavery. Yeah. And as the Constitution stands today, as you know, the only people that they can legally make into slaves are people who are convicted of a felony.
That's right. I'm sure you know this, right? About the firefighters in our glorious state, all the fires that we've had.
I'm working on that right now.
I'm sure you are. Yeah.
Root and Rebound. And
how many, what is it, about a third of the firefighters or something like that are inmates?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A friend of mine was killed during one of the fires in a chainsaw accident, and they couldn't get him out fast enough. He bled out, and a young woman was just killed a year or so ago. A boulder fell on her.
In Malibu, right?
Right, in Malibu. And then another guy that we also knew, a tree fell on him.
Yep.
And so these guys, right now we're working, Root and Rebound is involved in a national campaign where we got a couple of lawmakers who are doing legislation right now. We're going to be going and lobbying in about 2 weeks.
But Marvin, those prisoners chose that duty. That's not slavery.
Exactly. Well, I don't know that it's not. Here you are in the penitentiary, and here's your choices. You can be in your cell in San Quentin, and you can live that dark life behind the bars, or you can accept the state's offer to go out to the fire camp. Yeah. And then fight fires for them. And in doing so, you will not be in a cell in San Quentin. You'll just be in a barracks in the fire camp. and we'll even give you 12 cents an hour when you're on a fire, and you can buy some goodies at the canteen. So it's really a Hobson's choice.
Well, no, it's just slavery.
Right.
I was kidding.
Right.
I mean, it's the masses saying, well, you can go pick cotton today, or you can go fight the fire and I'll give you 12 cents for it.
Yeah.
Are those still slaves? Of course they are. Those people would not be fighting fires if they weren't inmates and they weren't compelled.
Well, we have some stories. I guess the next phase is to get the personal stories out. And we have people who fought fires for 3, 4, 5 years inside. And now that they're out, they wanted to go into firefighting, and they were told, you can't. The Occupational Licensing Board says you can't be licensed because of your felony conviction. And, if they are good enough to fight fires the whole time they're incarcerated out in the community, saving people's homes, then you should put your money where your mouth is when they come out. All this second chance initiative, all the rest of these things we're talking about, give them a job, because you're using like 2/3 of the firefighters are inmates because they don't have enough firefighters, and so you spent a lot of money training these men and women, and you should get some return on your correctional investment. They're highly trained, and fresh from the battlefield. These are remarkable people that you should put right to work when they get out.
Marvin, you were a slave when you were a child. You were enslaved by the state of California when you were a child.
Mm-hmm. And it's still happening today. You can find 10, 11-year-olds out pulling weeds.
I've seen them. When I've been hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains, I've seen teenagers with chainsaws who are part of and I see the label on the truck. It says something about, they have some euphemism, but it's basically a corrections unit of some sort.
Youth authority.
Yeah, some youth authority thing. It's, by the way, I got to interject this. I mean, I know you're sort of a fan of Jerry Brown because he actually was the one who signed off on your pardon, unlike Mr. Schwarzenegger before that.
I'm a fan of Jerry Brown's action that day, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, because you do know, right, of course, the history of the firefighters.
Exactly.
And Kamala Harris and Jerry Brown
are
responsible for a lot of that. They wouldn't allow parole for a lot of people because of this. And that was their argument in court. It's phenomenal, when you read that. And then they denied that they said it, which also it blows me away. But anyway. So you were a slave, man. You were a slave when you were a kid. I mean, that's just one of the things that happened to you. But just that alone. Mm-hmm. And you had a problem with authority.
Yeah. Go figure.
I don't understand that. It's weird. Yeah, it must be a mental illness.
It must be.
It's just
it must be delinquency. When the first time the first time I got sent to the boys' ranch, the judge said, and all I had ever done up to that point was run away from places. He said I was incorrigible. And so I went back and I looked it up in a dictionary and I was blown away. Really? No hope. Really? This is it. I am incorrigible. I could not believe that he called me that. And I even knew at that young age, this is not true for anybody. I mean, nobody's beyond redemption enough to where you would tell a child that he's incorrigible. But that's when they sentenced people to the boys' ranch back then. Most of the guys were sent there because they were, quote, incorrigible. And that's what their paperwork says. You're at the boys' ranch because you are incorrigible.
Yeah, it sounds to me like your thesis here is that the state created your identity for you when you were a child.
Right.
Is that right? Is that essentially your argument?
They attempted to. I think it's probably really amazing that I'm on this this podcast, because what was expected of us, even as children, in that environment, was total subservience. And what's really odd is when the children go to children prison, they punish you for acting like a child. They want you to act like a man.
Or a soldier.
Or a soldier, right.
Right, yeah.
And it's just the opposite in prison. If you act like a man in prison, they punish you. They want you to act like their child. I'm going to tell you what to do, and you better do it.
Right.
But if you're a man, you go, wait a minute, who do you think you're talking to? Or don't treat me this way. That's it for you.
Yeah.
You know, so it's completely opposite in the adult thing. But when you're a child, if you cry or if you are scared, you get punished. You had to be these little adults.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I am totally sympathetic to your metaphor about adult prisons, you know, being infantilizing. Right?
Exactly.
Like I'm sympathetic to that, but I think it's maybe not quite right, isn't it? That if I were a prison guard, I can say this, if I were a prison guard or a warden, what I would want is for you, all the prisoners, to be machines, robots, objects, neither a child or a man, right? They're subjects with will and agency and desires.
Oh, no will and agency.
And chaos, right? I mean, isn't that more apt?
Right.
I mean, you want them to be like chairs in this conference room that you can arrange around the table as you wish. Right.
But I was in a warden's meeting one time, and this is after our organization was in full force. I'll tell you about that. And I'll say this organization that we had inside, but I was at a meeting. We were negotiating the college program coming into the prison. And one of the captains said something about why this would not be possible because of the environment that we are living in. And I said, that's bullshit. And the associate warden's like, oh, he said bullshit in front of the warden. And everybody was freaking out. And I said, look, she's heard the word bullshit before. She certainly sees it every day. And so they wanted to put me in administrative segregation for that comment. And
which is what? Be specific. What does that mean? Administrative segregation?
Yeah, it means that they take you and put you in a solitary confinement situation. It was called the hole because the floor has a hole in it. And when you needed to use the bathroom, you sat on that hole, and that's where you went to the bathroom. It's called the hole. Just like in the jail cells that had a bucket for you to defecate in, it was called the bucket. You're going to the bucket.
But certainly it had a nice view of the bay, though, I'm sure.
It had nothing. Yeah. So that whole process was, people were really scared to go to the hole. I mean, if you go to administrative segregation, back then, they fed you what was called jute balls. The dining hall, you got fed off of trays, and the convicts would bring their trays at the end of their meal cycle to this big window, and you'd stack your tray in there, and it had all the whatever you didn't eat would be on the tray. And the people inside, before they sent the trays to the washing machine, they would scrape all the food into these buckets, and then those buckets would be poured into little pans and baked.
No.
Yes. And they would take those little loaves of leftovers and put them in the freezer. So when you went to Ad Seg, they'd say, we got 6 guys up in Ad Seg. So they'd break out for dinner. They'd break out 6 of those frozen loaves. They would warm them up, and they would send them upstairs to Ad Seg. And you ate jute balls. We had to actually litigate to get rid of jute balls from the Ad Seg.
Juke balls?
Jute.
Jute?
Like the jute mill.
Okay.
So
basically, it was just punitive.
Yeah, and so the litigation that we filed ended up getting rid of that. And in fact, the litigation caused them to have to bring a tray in, a cart in, and with pans of hot food from the dining hall. And the court said that whatever they're feeding them in the dining hall, you have to feed them in Ad Seg. And they had to serve the food onto your tray right in front of you in front of the cell and put it through the slot. So because we were also aware that some people who were unpopular with the guards, a lot of them were in Ad Seg for assaulting prison staff. because it was a war. They couldn't eat because the guards would do things to their food and they didn't want to eat it. So part of the agreement that we got the judge to go along with was that they had to serve this food up in front of you. So they would have to contaminate the whole pot, which I'm sure that they did, but...
The next Renegade University weekend with me is coming up soon, and it's happening in maybe the most renegade city of them all, New Orleans, Louisiana. It'll be from May 11th to May 13th, and it will include a live recording of the 1-year anniversary episode of Unregistered. There are still VIP and regular weekend tickets available. Go to thaddeusrussell.com/courses.
Once you've been up there for, back then it was 30 to 90 days for just regular stuff, you'd be in segregation.
This is solitary confinement.
Solitary confinement, 30 days in a hole to 90 days in a hole. But some guys had been up there 2 or 3 years. And so you can't just, they ended up naming it indefinite security housing unit, because they felt, according to their paperwork, they are deemed too dangerous to staff or other inmates to be out on the main line. And most of the people that were up there on indefinite SHU programs were people that they labeled as gang members, prison gang members, or shot callers, or they were politically unsavory.
Like you.
Right.
And you went to the hole, didn't you?
A lot of times.
A lot of times.
Yeah. I joined the prisoners union. As soon as I got to prison, I joined the prisoners union in 1975, and I was an organizer and an activist for maybe 2 years.
Was this like coming out of the Panthers, George Jackson, all that stuff, that movement? Or was this a different thing?
No, when I got in, as soon as I got to prison, I went to the law library right away. I didn't know much about law, but I knew it was the law that put me there, what they used to incarcerate me. So I figured I could reverse engineer that and figure out what it is that would get me out, right? Mm-hmm. So I started going to the law library, and while I was there, one of the guys that worked in the law library was a member of the prisoners union, and he introduced me to some of the literature. I wrote to a guy named John Irwin. John Irwin did a 5 to life term for armed robbery back in the 50s. He got out. He got his credentials. He became a tenured professor at San Francisco State for 27 years. He created Project Rebound that helps prisoners when they get out get into the college program. I started corresponding with him in 1975. By 77, when the prisoners union fell apart, he actually was instrumental in getting me the platform for the prisoners union. I took that and rewrote it. And the warden at that time had this failed diversionary grievance system. They did not like the fact that prisoners were going to their prisoners union representative and going with their grievances. So he created a grievance process where you could file a grievance with the administration and they would try and fix what's going on. And it never took off. It was called the Inmate Advisory Council. And it never took it was dead and defunct. By 77, it was just not happening. Right. And so, as a matter of fact, the prisoners that were representing that were being whacked. They were being taken out. And so they had to stop it because it was putting people's lives in danger. They felt that they were working for the administration. Yeah. And
they were whacked by the prisoners. Oh, right. Because I see.
Right. So people did not want to do that job for the warden. When the prisoners union imploded, and it's still extant today, but when in 77, when everything was going, they had a big row out in the prisoners union head office in San Francisco. They were sticking guns in each other's mouth, fighting over union dues and that kind of stuff. And it just imploded. It never was the same after that. It's still around today, but it just wasn't the same. Yeah. And so I took that platform and I married it to that diversionary system, because I figured we could advocate from the inside out. I wanted to have elections. I wanted to have the guys elect who they want to represent them. And so the warden thought that was a ridiculous contention. Elections, yeah, right. So we ended up going to court, and the court ordered the institution allow us to have elections. And we had elections. I was elected to chair the first Men's Advisory Council, which is what we called it, the MAC. I took the word inmate out, and we called it the Men's Advisory Council. And we announced it to the administration, to the population, that we were a conduit to communicate our needs to the administration, and conversely, their needs to the population. We had a big problem at that time with work strikes and other things that were happening. And they were locked down for a long time. Every time there was a violent incident, there was a lot of guards being hurt. There was a lot of inmates getting beaten, and some of them shot around the system. At that time, there was only I would say there was only 6 prisons, or around 6 prisons. And so really
in California,
in
maximum
California,
security.
yeah. In California, which is really odd. But, in 1984, there was 11 prisons in California. From 1852 to 1984, 130 plus years, California built 11 prisons. Mm-hmm. Between 84 and 94, they built 22 more. Mm-hmm. Now, the Cold War had wound down. They were closing bases. They had these people coming out of the military economy they did not know what to do with. So they seamlessly started adjusting the parole laws and the laws in California. They started that whole war on fill in the blanks, mm-hmm. violence, guns, drugs, whatever, mm-hmm. gangs. Mm-hmm. And they started building prisons. They went from 26,000 prisoners to 174,000 prisoners in 10 years. And
right.
And so they replaced that missing piece of economy with a correctional economy. Mm-hmm. But anyway, back when we started this organization and we got the first elections out of the way, we got our first council. One of our first battles that really hit the public consciousness was we had this thing going on with transgender inmates. They weren't called transgender then. They were just these guys. They were segregating them because the whole Ryan White thing had come out. And
so this is in the 80s?
Yeah.
Okay.
All of the other stuff before that was just trying to set up the culture that we were looking for. Mm-hmm. But one of the bigger things was the whole Ryan White thing, like in 81.
What was Ryan White, or what was that case?
He was a young hemophiliac, a young boy who during a transfusion contracted AIDS,
right.
And they burnt his house. And they wouldn't let him go to school. The school district said, you can't go to school because you give everybody AIDS. Mm-hmm. So they were actually segregating gay men, mm-hmm. and because of the AIDS problem. And anybody found to have AIDS went to segregation, ad-seg. We ended up filing a court case. A lot of these guys were life prisoners that were subject to the parole board. And the parole board, you could not pass muster unless you were involved with programs. So we were able to successfully argue that at a constitutional level, they cannot require programs for somebody to win their freedom and then lock them up to where they can't get the programs. So they have they have created a constitutional situation where it was a liberty interest because they were in the United States and they can't get out. They were there forever. So they told the institutions that they had to desegregate all of these people, and which wasn't a lot back then. They desegregated them, and it really put us on the map with Sacramento. After that, they were like, "Oh, we gotta deal with these guys. They know people, and they know judges." And we had a lot of support from the community, a lot of stars. And
how did that go over with the prisoners, with the inmates?
That was another thing. I mean, a lot of we figured out right away that we had to go into high gear with Sacramento and the administration of San Quentin and ask for peer education programs. I said, we need to have a peer education group where people who have been trained and are knowledgeable in the transmission of HIV can explain to guards, administrators, and the prisoners that you cannot catch HIV, you cannot get AIDS by living in a cell with or searching the cell of or walking down the tier with somebody who has AIDS. And it was a big thing. I mean, there was prisoners that were really upset that these guys were coming to population. And some of those guys, which is still a very sad thing for me, some of the first people that came out of segregation who had AIDS, some of them were killed by people in Folsom and in Soledad. Some of them were killed. I think there was 3 people across the system that ended up killed because they put them in the cell with the wrong person or in the wrong cell block. Based on those deaths, we were able to convince Sacramento to release funds to put together peer education programs, which are still extant today. There's peer education programs everywhere in the system. Any joint you go to, there's Center Force or one of those places that do peer education. But they put us on the map.
Yeah, it seems so. You came along sort of at the tail end of the movement I was referring to, the big prisoner rights movement, or really, it was really a prisoners' rebellion in the country as a whole,
right?
Which begins in the late 60s.
That ended with the death of George Jackson,
right? George Jackson, Soledad brother. Yeah. So Attica, of course, is kind of the most famous event in that movement. Early 70s, I remember being taken to a screening. I don't know if you know who Popeye Jackson was, but I met him when I was 8
He's
or 9
one of the
years
guys
old.
who was putting guns in people's mouths in the prisoners' union. Right.
That's good to know, because my parents did stuff around that in the early 70s when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I remember meeting him, and he came to our house, and we went to a documentary about Attica, so a screening of a movie about Attica, and he was there and he gave a talk, and then I think a year later he was killed, something like that, right? And I was wondering, interesting, he maybe was a criminal, but or a dangerous guy, but so there was all this energy among prisoners, rebellious energy in places like Attica, places like San Quentin, right? And because if you think about it, it was this perfect storm in a sense. 84 is definitely an important moment. That there's certainly another spike in incarceration and the building of prisons beginning then during the Reagan era, no doubt about it. But it's actually a little earlier, the roots of this stuff. So it's really in the Johnson administration in the 60s, right? The crime bill under Johnson, which is conveniently overlooked by a lot of liberals.
That's where that language started, that whole war on.
Yeah, so the war on crime, that was coined by him, and the war on drugs really began then under Lyndon Baines Johnson. When he was killing Vietnamese, he was doing a good job on the people here too. Yeah, no, I mean, he's really one of the worst people ever. And he gets it's amazing that liberals have anything good to say about him. But anyway, so he launches the war on crime, the war on drugs, which of course leads to greater incarceration. It also creates black markets in places like, East Oakland and Watts and Harlem, right? And so you get...
Well, that's the feeding ground for the mass incarceration.
Yeah. And so you get, and so it's largely Black population going into these prisons.
Right.
At the very same time, right, that you have this counterculture, this, political radicalism is sort of in vogue. And you have the Black Panthers and you have the Nation of Islam, talking about, this isn't our country. The government isn't our government, right? And so you have this this powerful rebellious energy among these people, many of whom are uneducated, except they might know enough to be rebellious and have some words to attach to it once they're in the prison for dealing the heroin, right? And so they end up, of course, as a lot of people know, they shut down. There's a riot at Attica, most famously, and they shut it down. And then Nelson Rockefeller, who's the author of the Rockefeller drug laws, which is mandatory minimums, putting people away forever for dealing drugs or even possessing drugs. I mean, in 1973, I believe. He has the state guard or the state police surround the prison with rifles and just shoot the prisoners inside the yard.
Exactly.
Like fish in a barrel. Yeah. And so similar stuff is going on at San Quentin, and that's what you're saying. And so when you get there, which is just 2 years after Attica, right? I'm sure San Quentin looked sort of similar.
Yeah,
right?
It was.
Yeah. And so, you have this political consciousness among prisoners right at the same time you're putting more prisoners in these cages. And you're sort of that way, and you're not Black, you're not a Black Panther, but you bring a consciousness with you into that place. So you were very dangerous when you got there.
Well, there's a purpose. Like one of the more controversial things that I talk about, I believe, while mass incarceration has its roots in racism, today it's more about socioeconomic. If the marginalized communities around California were filled with white people, prison would be filled with white people.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you. God bless you for saying that. Amen. I know this is what I've been saying over and over again, right? Because
it's unpopular to say.
Because in the 1920s, speaking of Jews, guess who the criminals were? Guess who the bootleggers were? Right. And guess who was going to prison and getting shot by cops in the streets? It was Jews and Italians, right? Because they were the ones during Prohibition who filled that black market. Yeah.
And that was like after the Irish became white.
That's right. You've been doing a lot of reading. Did you have some time on your hands to do some reading?
I did.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, like what you've read. I'm so curious about what you've actually read in all that time. But so can I go back to something? I want to go back. So I'm struck. It seems like there's a very important moment for you formatively when you hitchhiked across the country and then got a ride back to San Francisco or back to the Bay Area from this couple. It was like a hippie couple. Sounds like a lot of your political consciousness sort of came, or at least began with them.
They were members of the Students for a Democratic Society.
Aha, SDS. Okay, yeah. I have this thing because I come out of the left. My parents were leftists. I can just sort of know. As I hear someone, it's like being probably born in a church or something. Like my father could tell a Mormon as soon as they started talking. And it's like me, like if I hear someone who's political start talking, I can pretty quickly know like more or less which political group or tendency they come from in some way. And I could tell, I didn't know exactly where you came from, but it had to be something along those lines. So SDS, of course, was the biggest and most famous radical student organization.
Their friends were Weathermen
in the 60s. Oh, they were what? They were, okay, the far left of this SDS. Right. They were Weather people, Weather Underground. Right. Were they members? Were they actual?
No, they were SDS. Their friends were Weathermen. And I didn't see much of them. They were very secretive, and they're always up to something. I mean...
Were you talking about the couple who gave you the ride?
No, the Weathermen.
Oh, sure. I mean, so who were that? So they were members of the SDS, this couple who gave you the ride.
Right.
And who else were they? I mean...
Well, they had friends who were into Weathermen. And, they... I think they were even associated with the early Symbionese Liberation Army.
SLA, who kidnapped Patty Hearst.
Exactly. But, I wasn't involved in any of that. My introduction into the next phase of my politics was I already had the base. I was already an injustice collector. I just did not know what to do with it. I wasn't a child anymore as far as I was concerned. And now I'm wondering, well, I can't keep throwing ashtrays through glass windows. So what do I do? And these people introduced me to the action arm of the movement as it existed at that time. And so that was my only association with them. After that, we saw each other briefly at rallies and other stuff. But like I said, I questioned early on the effectiveness. I said, okay, so we buried a car full of grapes. I mean, what?
Yeah.
I mean, so that's over now? Is it over?
Right.
I mean, so what did we do except bury a car?
Yeah.
And we made the newspaper. We had the local news was there and had us on camera, and but it was over after that. And so I always looked for something deeper and bigger.
And you were looking for an analysis,
right?
You?
Exactly.
Is that right? Okay.
Exactly.
And you have one now, clearly.
I do.
And that was the beginning of building an analysis. So my parents were members of Young People's Socialist League, which then became the International Socialists. They were Trotskyists, a very particular sect and with a very particular politics. Were you ever involved with or around groups like that, organized groups?
The Workers' Party and the Communist Workers' Party. I knew people that were in that. I don't know that
when you were a teenager. I mean,
right?
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know that. I don't know that I ever.
Communist Workers' Party was.
I think it's now the International Workers' Party,
which was. I'm trying to remember. That's not. They're not Maoists, right? Or were they? Wait, who's
I don't know. I wasn't that closely associated.
Didn't even know. Okay. So
I was.
clearly.
I'm actually. I've never thought that communism or capitalism has any room to tout its own virtues, because there is no such thing as true capitalism or true communism. It's this hybrid that happens, and nobody talks about that. It's like, I hate communists, but there are things that you do that are socialists that are. I don't know. I think the people that probably are most honest about both of the systems would be the whole kibbutz system, where people live together in these communities.
Yeah, true communism.
Yeah. But we have nothing like that here. And so, and I have never been in that environment. I know they had communes that I had been to just before I was arrested on this. I had the opportunity to go up and hang out at a commune for about a month. And they try, but people were going out and buying stuff and bringing back, they were buying cases of beer and steaks from.
It's hard living on on the land.
Right.
They found out, right, without beer.
Taking me to that whole when
I'm sorry. I'm just thinking about, you and I both grew up in the same place at the same time, although not exactly the same place and not exactly the same time, but pretty close. So it's the East Bay. But you come from Union City, which was...
I was only there for a minute. I mean,
okay.
I lived in San Jose most of my young life. Santa Clara, San Jose. Most of that time was in boys' ranches in Morgan Hill and places like that. Coyote.
Yeah. So what we would say is you come from the working class section of, right? And working class culture.
And then we went to Livermore.
Yeah, which is all working class then, I think, right?
Yeah,
my stepfather was a steel worker in Fremont near where you were, right, at the time, but not because he had to be, he chose to be, so he could organize the workers. So that's how deep it goes with me. But anyway, but in Berkeley, it was a different story, of course. It's all middle class, or upper class lefties, right? And so, but the East Bay in the 70s, almost no matter where you were, was just full of all these radical groups, right? Of all sorts of persuasions, but everybody was on the left, and it was just in the air. And it was really, you could just throw a rock and you'd hit some Trotskyist or Maoist or Stalinist or somebody like that, right? Did you identify as a socialist?
No.
as a teenager?
No. I didn't have a political identity.
Okay.
I really had this desire to fix things that were wrong. And so to me, it wasn't so much as a movement. I wasn't seeing the mosaic yet. I was seeing the broken thing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what's the problem here? These guys are picking grapes and not getting paid.
Right.
They're sleeping in cardboard boxes. Oh, okay. Right. So what are we going to do? Yeah, we're going to have a rally, and we're going to. Okay, so I'd like to go see
Right.
that. It ended up bearing a car full of grapes, and to me, it was very unsatisfying. It wasn't until later that I figured out that if you're going to affect any type of change, you have to change the culture and the narrative, and you have to do it through the mechanisms that are available to you, the legislation, and you have to. It's a long process.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you came along, as I said, at the end of that great tumult, that upheaval in the late 60s and early 70s. It's kind of the energy is sort of still there, but what I think sounds like what you did was you channeled it. You channeled that
Right.
energy instead of just having a riot and taking over the prison, which of course is going to end in, mass murder of you and your comrades. It sounds like you kind of became, in a sense, an administrator of this movement.
Well, it actually allowed me to take what I already knew. Look, the San Quentin was important to the movement. If you ever get a chance to read, you maybe already have read it. There's a book called The Rise and Fall of California's Radical Prison Movement.
I have not read it. I am aware of the book, and I think I've skimmed it or looked at parts of it.
That book is 100%
yes,
probably the best, most accurate book that I've read about the movement, which I was in.
Right.
And one of the things I realized when I got to prison and I started getting my political legs under me, I realized that I had no weapons. I was naked, and I had nothing that would compel this entity that I was swallowed up by to even care about what my thoughts were.
Mm-hmm.
Until I figured out that there are people outside of the walls who are politically powerful that cared about what was happening in there, and they just needed to have the information and to have the person inside that could throw the tethers over the wall and hook us up.
Yep.
So the Muslims you mentioned a while ago, they were very important to the early movement, and but they were recognized as being this. Look, the administration knew that these guys could be real trouble. We have to suppress them, so they labeled them a disruptive group. Just this close to being a prison gang, they called them a disruptive group and made it illegal for them to gather or to have discussions. Muslims could not be in more than, if there was three of them walking around the track, two of them had to walk, one had to walk behind. They couldn't walk together.
Because some of the audience will be younger, they might be a little confused now. We're talking about Black Muslims.
Right,
yeah.
the Black Muslim movement. And so we ended up going to court, our organization, and we assisted one of the Black Muslims in filing a habeas corpus, asking to be recognized as a religion. Mm-hmm. And they the court ruled in their favor, said the department will recognize this huge religion as, of course, a legitimate religion. And they had to build a masjid on the grounds for them to meet in. And they turned it into a temple and a masjid. One door had Hebrew written over the door, where the Jewish prisoners and their rabbi were able to go in. The state was compelled to hire a Muslim imam and a Jewish rabbi. they called them state chaplains, and they would come in and they shared this space. They had a rabbi's office and an imam's office in the same building, and they would hold their services on different days at different times. But they had to be officially recognized, and it made them legally legitimate.
Yeah. So, the word I'm thinking of now is co-optation, right? And I'm sure you were charged with that. And I think I might charge you with that too. I'm not sure. I mean, so the thing about the Black Muslims at the time was that they were largely Black nationalists as well, coming out of the Nation of Islam. And which, was that we don't belong to this country or this government or this state. This does not represent us. This is not our place. And we have, we want to establish a separate entity entirely, right? So that's a real problem when they are in a state institution, of course, for the state institution. I mean, I'm entirely on their side in that, and so I would imagine you heard this many times and probably still do, that you took that energy, which was rebellious in a really fundamental way, you could say revolutionary, and then made it into a state directed and managed institution by having the state make the imams into chaplains, et cetera, and having but you weren't behind this, or were you? I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? In other words, right?
Well, yeah, but you don't know. You got to take the good with the bad. With
I don't know where I stand on it. I'm just thinking about this.
I still don't know where I stand on it because some of the people that they brought in to run those programs, I know them to be agents, and I know them to be
agents of
the system.
Okay.
They were there to control these men, right?
Of course.
And so I did not like that, but it legitimized their voice. San Quentin was we were able to, there was a guy that ran the library. He would come in every day and he would encourage people to read the great books, right? And then he would ask them how they felt that book related to their life and and he had these groups, bibliotherapy. He brought it to San Quentin. And it was great. Prisoners in San Quentin were reading phenomenal numbers of books, and they had this huge library that developed there. This guy kept copious records of the reading habits of the entire population of San Quentin for 20 years. And it was a great tomb of knowledge. And he had a heart attack and died. And when he died, they replaced him with a guard, and they destroyed all of his records. It's all gone. None of the stuff is there. But as a result of this guy, Herman Specter, who's responsible for San Quentin becoming sort of like the criminal version of Yaddo. I mean, they were writing books and anthologies, and they were writing so many manuscripts that the state started charging an agent's fee on every manuscript that was leaving.
Talk about co-optation.
Exactly.
Wow.
But we had, starting with Carl Chessman and going on through that.
Who was executed at San Quentin in the 60s, right? Yeah.
These voices that were coming out of the prison system.
He wrote a memoir, right?
Right.
Yeah, famous memoir, yeah.
His...
which led to what? The California, it sort of led to at least a movement to ban the death penalty, to stop the death penalty.
Right. Yeah, those walls don't just keep people in, they keep people out. And I've always known it was important for us to get our tethers over the wall and hook ourselves up to the community. I think I said something earlier about the fact that this last fiscal year, the state taxpayers paid $13 billion to run California's 33 prisons. $13 billion. And the taxpayers are getting absolutely no return on their correctional investment. And it's time people started asking what's being done in their name inside. And the only way that's going to happen is that people get a glimpse inside. Like you said, for years you grew up in the shadow of San Quentin, and you knew it was there, but it was this mysterious place. On our end, I used to look out from the yard and see Mount Tam, it was sort of like this.
Wow.
It was sort of like this symbol of freedom that guys that are there, they look at it and they say, wow, this place. And almost to the last person, myself included, most guys who spent decades there looking at that mountain, we journeyed to that mountain. When I was out maybe 3 weeks, I went to Mount Tam and got up on top of it and saw San Quentin. And when you see it from that perspective, when you see San Quentin from the top of Mount Tam, you realize it's this little spot down there. And what seemed like your entire life while you're inside, you realize that is just a small part of your life. This is just a small thing now that you're standing up there looking at it. But that from the other, when looking the other direction, it seems like it's just this insurmountable well of darkness. Prison is there's this darkness that seeps into your bones, and if you don't keep at least one lamp lit inside, you become as dark as the place that you're in. So the guys that make it through that experience are guys that have some way to keep that pilot light on. Mm-hmm. And I think my advocacy over the years, the college program, that was really huge. We wanted to get live college programs, and we wanted guys to be able to get an AA degree. And the guards union was opposing us, and so we filed on that. And the judge, the offer from the guards was that why don't the professors just give their classes on camera and the guys can watch it in a TV screen inside the room, inside education, called distance learning. And the judge said, tell me why you think that's a bad idea. My response was that the value of the program isn't the information that's being imparted. The value of the program is in the socialization effect of these professors and these students that are coming in, interacting with the men. These are people that these men would never meet in South Central or East LA. They're never going to run into somebody like that. And the transformation was remarkable. These guys who were gang members and drug dealers and armed robbers and things that, the acts that they did leading up to being incarcerated, they immediately they abandoned those personas that they became comfortable in. Yeah, I'm an armed robber. They would say this. Yeah, I'm a burglar. Yeah. Would now say, yeah, I'm a business major. And they left the fellas that they were hanging out with on the yard, and they were in study circles, and they were in their cells flipping through textbooks, and it changed their entire life. Mm-hmm. We also got this program. I don't know if you've heard of the Last Mile. Have you heard of that? Mm-mm. The Last Mile is a data. It's a program where guys, after years of litigating and getting Sacramento to get on board with this, we started with data processing. We wanted the guys to learn data processing because computers are a thing, and the regulation said inmates are not allowed to have access to any computer systems or programs. And we got that regulation changed. We got data processing put in. And we found out that when guys started the data processing courses, that's when I figured out that when they say guys made bad choices or bad decisions and went to prison, I don't think they made choices at all. I think they were just hurtling through life and crash landed in a cell one day, and they don't even know why. Because when they started using the graphic user interfaces in Windows and in the Office packages, it did two things immediately. First, it satisfied their need for control, which all the convicts had, and the need for instant gratification, which they all suffered.
Mm-hmm.
So they found when they pushed this button, something happened. When they wanted to do something, they had to set a goal. I want to write a letter. So I pull up this package, push this button, this menu comes up. I pull down this menu. There's 9 things on it. I choose that. This happens. All these things happen. You got to make all these choices, pull down several menus. By the time you're done, you have to save it the right way and then print it. And all these decisions to make these menus. Almost immediately in their personal life, out on the tier, out on the yard, in the cell block, if they're confronted with a situation, they pull down this mental menu and they go, I can do this, but then this is going to happen. Or I can do this, and then this is going to happen. For the first time, they're looking at logical choices, and they're weighing the consequences. And it was immediate. It's one of the biggest things that changed the culture at San Quentin is when they started letting these guys have access to this type of decision-making tool. Has
the prison guards union changed its tune on this?
They had to.
Do they see it in their interest? See, I'm thinking about...
Well, actually, the guys that they have now...
if I were a prison guard, I'm thinking, what would I want, right? And I can think that education could cut either way for me as a prison guard of the inmates, right? I can think they could go and become more radical Black nationalist Muslims, or they could become data processors.
Right.
And we'd love them to be data processors, wouldn't we? Right. So, and it sounds like you're saying it tended to go in that latter direction, the inmates, right, lately. But in the 70s and 60s and 70s, a little reading, a little education was a dangerous thing for the prison guards. Not now, I'm thinking. It's actually a means of co-optation into the broader system, which makes you actually more malleable, at least, and safer, from the point of view of the warden and the guards. It's
your entryway into the... Look, guys had believed their whole lives that the system isn't for them, that the system is exclusive, not inclusive of them. This flips it around. Now you are inclusive, not exclusive of the system. And
I know, but what do we want, though?
You
and me. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, I think you and I are more or less on the same page in terms of drugs, war on crime, incarceration rates and all that, I think, generally. So right from our position, from our point of view, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm really torn. I think if I were an inmate in San Quentin, I would definitely want them to be data processors. Right. I'm not terribly interested, especially as a white guy, having a bunch of Black Muslim nationalists running around me, Right. So I don't know, but it's a tough call, right? But then at the same time,
well, it's contrary to what
the radical energy, which you have and had when you were inside, is leading to a very good change, a profound change in this prison system that we hate, you and I, right? So.
It's counterintuitive as far as the guards are concerned, because control requires that there be no thought on the controlled person's part, no self-identity.
Correct. Good point.
This is why they used to shave our heads and make us wear prison blues and put our number on our shirt and on our pockets on our pants. This was a page right out of the concentration and re-education camps.
Sure.
I mean, this is what they did.
Of course.
We actually filed and got the grooming standard reversed, where we were allowed to grow our hair and our mustache and our beards, and we were allowed to have our own Levi's and our own shoes, tennis shoes and whatever. And it gave the guys a sense of identity. They could have a style and they could have an individual identity. And this was all through the 70s and 80s. We were enjoying this victory. In the 90s, at the end of the 90s, around 2000, a more conservative set of administrators came into power in Sacramento, and they started undoing all of these things because they saw them as harmful to the control that they had. One of the first things they did was get rid of personal Levi's, which was really ridiculous because 2/3 of the men had spent their own money to buy Levi's. They belonged to them. The state did not have to provide them. The facilities were told to confiscate them, so they confiscated them all. And they hired more people in prison industries, and they started making prison blues again. And only this time, the prison blues, the pants and the shirts, came with an added feature. They said, California prisoner, down the legs and across the back. So every time
there's
you looked,
your identity.
right, yeah. you everywhere you looked, you saw California prisoner. When you looked down at your own clothes, you saw you're a California prisoner. And so they enwrapped these men in the prisoner persona. And you can't unwrap somebody in that persona from gate to gate. If you release a prisoner, by definition, they come back because they need a prison. So what we need to do is kind of transform these men from prisoner to person. Somewhere in the process, we have to bring them to that point of personage where they leave here a fully actualized identity with some kind of positive purpose. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is these guys are being released as prisoners, and they're very uncomfortable outside that gate, outside the constraints and the control of that prison environment.
Right.
And so it's no wonder that they fail at such a great rate.
So the California Prison Guards Union. Okay. You mentioned it. We've talked about it a bit, but I think a lot of people don't really know what this thing is, right? What's the formal name of it again? Is that
California Correctional Peace Officers Association.
Peace officers. Okay. Okay. So I'm sure you know the numbers here roughly, so how many members roughly? How many members do they have in the union?
I don't know. I think each institution has 400 to 600 correctional officers, and there's 33 institutions.
Oh my!
But here's the smart thing: they had this guy that ran the CCPOA, Don Novi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, he is.
Brilliant.
Sure
I'm telling you, he took this small fledgling security guard union that they had, this a California Correctional Officers Association. And first thing he did was, it's a page right out of my book, is he understood that you can make all of these complaints and do all the rest of this thing, but unless you get some type of legislative change, then it's all for naught. So he went out and he got lawmakers to recognize these guys as peace officers, which immediately brought them into, they had the right under the law to be paid commensurate with other peace officers. So now prison guards who are getting minimum wage are now getting paid as much as police officers. And so that was number one. That was the biggest thing. But they also gave them a right to carry firearms. It also gave them the right to arrest people. It also gave them the right to do a whole lot of other things. And when they were assaulted inside, or when they were involved in an altercation where they said they were assaulted, the crime that is committed for touching a peace officer is 10 times what it would be if you touched a security guard. So there was a lot of protections that came with this status, and it gave them political clout.
Yep.
They became the most powerful union in political history of California.
And political lobbyist.
Exactly.
One of the most powerful political lobbyists in the state for decades.
So I think he was brilliant.
So let's trace this, okay?
The evil brilliance,
yeah, no, it'd be fascinating to get you and him in the same room and have, is he still the head of the union?
No. Yeah. When he left, they went through a series of changes. There was one guy that ran the union for a while that actually sold out the members. He gave back. He participated in a series of givebacks to the administration in Sacramento. He gave up a lot of really hard-earned gains that Novi had put in, and that whole debacle of where they said they were going to save money by furloughing. Guards were doing furloughs, but they found a way around that immediately. They started doing swaps, and they ended up doing twice as much overtime under the furlough system than they did before. Right. They spend, California today spends $3.5 million a month in guard overtime. A month, $3.5 million a month in guard overtime.
It's the second, am I right, the second largest prison system among the states, California's? Isn't Texas is number one?
Yeah, Texas
California's number two.
Yeah, and then you got Florida
Huge.
and Arizona.
So let's do this, right? So let's just look at the money part, right? How the money flows and operates here. Mm-hmm. It's quite a one might say a racket. So you have the prison guards get paid by the state, and then they have to be a member of the union, mm-hmm. right? Which means they have to give dues to the union, which of course is money that comes from the state wages. And the dues go to the union, which lobbies the legislature for whatever is in the interests of the guards and the union, right? All that money comes from me. Right. And the taxpayers of California. And I really mean me and poorer people than me, because everybody gets taxed here in this state, big time. And so, of course, it is in their interest to have more prisoners, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Right? Because then they get more money. And so there you go with your blue jeans and your sneakers and having your own individual identity. We're not going to be interested in that. We want you as the prison guards, don't we? And the union in particular, Don Novi, to be criminals. We want your identity. I take it this is what your argument is. I think you're right, to be that of a criminal. And so, they would want you to identify as a criminal, as a member of the carceral system. It's phenomenal. And people don't get this. Tell me what you think about the whole private prison thing. I find it to be barking up the wrong tree. Mostly, of course, it's a thing, but what is it, like 6% or 5% of prisoners?
No, it's not even that much.
Thank you.
It's several thousand.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's nothing compared to what the carceral state has locked up. But they came to town in California to build private prisons, and they had friends in.
You mean like a private prison corporation or something did this?
To build private prisons to put California prisoners in, because California, when I keep talking about our group and the legislation that we filed, the litigation that we filed, but one of the things that we were involved with early on was helping several prisoners file administrative appeals on their treatment by medical inside CDCR. We knew that we were so overcrowded that our medical care was suffering to the point where people were dying. And so once it got to the level of a class action, of course, the prison law office took it over, and our job was done. But it started the ball rolling, and the law is very clear that we're entitled to community standard health care, and that's not what was happening. So the state ended up going into receivership. And at that point, they had like 174,000 prisoners across the state in 33 prisons. They had bunk beds on the tier in front of the cells with people sleeping in these things in front of your cell. They called them ugly beds in the courts, and we called them Broadway. Because if where do you sleep? I sleep on Broadway. You're sleeping out on a bunk bed in front of the cells, and it was really ugly. Seriously, the court had the right name. These ugly beds, which was a bed that was in any area that was not originally designated for housing. That bed. So we ended up having to file on that, and they went into receivership, and they were ordered to start decreasing the population. And the state's very crafty when their attorneys are very crafty, and they because of the vague awareness that people maintain about the prison system and how it works, with the courts saying things like the state has great, almost unlimited power to make decisions concerning safety and security of the operation of their prison. And the courts divorce themselves and tell everybody else they're divorced from interfering with the operation of these prisons. So
that's what a state is. It's a monopoly on violence and power. Right? Yes, it can do whatever it wants to us. That's right.
So they started releasing people. So here comes the private prisons. The idea was we won't really release them. What we'll do is we'll build you some private prisons, and you can put them in our prison and pay us to house your prisoners. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you're decreasing the population of the CDCR effectively, but you still have the prisoners.
Right.
And the judge, Henderson, and the rest of them said, that's not going to work. There's still going to be California prisoners. California's still going to be responsible for their health care, paying you to do it. And you guys have a miserable track record taking care of people. There's more people dying in private prisons than any place else. So that didn't work. So now the guards union also saw that they did not want private prison guards taking care of California prisoners because it cuts into their action. Mm-hmm. And so they ended up coming to an agreement where, we're not going to, first they were going to agree to let them build private prisons, but you had to use academy officers. So you can have your prison, but you have to hire us to be in it. And we'll just train some more people and we'll put some more CCPOA members in there. That didn't work at the legislative level. So then the private prison companies said, we'll just get into the post-incarceration business. You guys house them. When they're done, you make them go to transitional housing, which is our companies, and they have to stay in our place for 6 months when they get out. And we're going to put them through groups and we're theoretically going to give them the resources they need to make it. So now we have CDCR feeding bodies into these transitional houses across the state, these private companies. The administration of the board right now is looking into getting away from those transitional houses, and they want to create a series of transitional houses that are run by the Department of Corrections to assist people when they get out through their parole department. But now they had 72,000 to 91,000 technical violators coming through the CDCR system every year. These technical violators were people that the parole officers who the CCPOA, during their negotiations to become peace officers, soon after they became peace officers, decided we're going to bring parole officers into our union. So now parole officers are CCPOA members, and parole officers are the ones that decide, you know what? I don't like your attitude, and you gave me a dirty drug test. I'm sending you back to prison. This is not without a judge. This is without a judge or anybody else. The parole officer decides, I'm sending you back to prison. And you end up back in the joint, sitting in San Quentin, going, what the hell? And there's another guard blocking your door, another CCPOA member blocking your door, and you're there from 6 to 8 months. You get your Morrissey and your Valdivia hearing where some administrator, a CDCR administrator, not a judge, some administrator says, I'm going to continue you on parole, so go back out to parole. Or I'm giving you a year, and you're going to be here another year. So they keep these beds filling depending on their needs. They did. Based on these violations, 92,000 or 91,000 a year on average. And then realignment came along. This is one of the mechanisms Brown used to reduce the population. He knew that if I realigned all these guys that are coming in for dirty tests and for, missing curfew or whatever it was, they're sending them back to this $52,000 a year bed. Mm-hmm. Now it's $72,000 a year. But at the time he made the decision, it was $52,000 a year to keep somebody in prison on average. Now it's $74,000 a year on average to keep somebody in prison. But he said, if I can just divert 91,000, it gets me really close to the goal that the judge wants me to drop my population to. So he decided all these drug cases, all these violations, all these people, they'll go to the county jail. If you want to arrest this guy and send him back to incarceration, you'll do it in your county jail, not my prison. And so they put all these people in the county jail, which now has the same problems as the state did. There's no programs for them. They changed the law to say that an individual can be in the county jail now up to 25 years. So, but basically, instead of 33 prisons, you have hundreds of prisons in California because they got guys doing 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 20 years in those county jails. And now they're starting to get lawsuits. Hey, I want vocational training. Hey, I want education. Hey, I want exercise commensurate with what they're getting in prison. I want the same equipment. I want that. I want visiting to be not through some window on the wall on a phone. I want a visiting room.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's mass incarceration is a great jobs creation program, Marvin.
Exactly.
Come on. So here's what I'm thinking. You know what I'm thinking right now? I'm thinking whether I want to go back to whether you're innocent or not.
Yeah, let me give you
I don't know.
a little backspace on this.
Yeah.
When I got out of
can I just interject real quickly and ask you a question? Am I right in thinking that you are unusual among prison rights activists in that way, that most of them, am I right, have not claimed to be innocent?
Most guys in prison do not say they're innocent. That's fake news. That's alternative facts, where everybody says they're innocent. No, I was in prison for a long time, and I can count on one hand people.
Right, you're very unusual.
Right.
Yeah.
That say they're innocent. Okay. So, look, when they're
actually criminals.
Right,
they really did it in the vast majority of cases.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. But like I said, that does not define the person.
Mm-hmm.
And
it also doesn't address the cause of the crime. Sure.
Exactly.
Sure. Different questions. Yes.
So, when I got out of high school, I got myself a job as a security guard. And one of the places that I was working at was on the graveyard shift, was a Bell potato chip factory. And they had a practice of taking these trucks and loading them up with these cases of potato chips and snack cakes and stuff, and backing the truck trailer up to this cyclone fence so people couldn't get into them at night. And then in the morning, they would take the truck, hook up the trailers, and they would take them wherever they're going. But they're loaded at night. And then in the morning, the truckers come and they take them away. So myself and another security guard were of the habit of, and my mother was in a hospital at the time. I was taking care of my 3 sisters. I got the job primarily so we can get food and stuff for the house. So we got into the habit of jumping over this fence and going through a field that was overgrown, maybe chest high, with this vegetation. It was like a marsh in there because the sun never hit it. It was always foggy. It was wet all night. And in the day, it never dried up. So to get to the back of that cyclone fence where the truck trailers were, you'd have to go through the trailer, climb over the fence, get down between the fence and the truck and open the back thing and throw a case over to the other guy. And then we take them and put them in the trunk of our car. It was not big theft. It was, it was a box of potato chips, right? Which we were eating at home. But in the process, you would get wet and you would get muddy. And on more than one occasion, I'd say a half a dozen times, I came home in that condition. This is a very important part and piece of the whole story. So when I would get off work on my other security guard job, I worked 2 shifts most of the time because they were very short, and they allowed me to work 2 sides, making money for 2 weeks. 3 weeks I was a security guard. I would stop at the park that was down the street from my house, and I would see this girl there named Linda. And so I talked to her for a while, and then I would drive to Livermore to my girlfriend's house. And I know.
You were double timing.
Yeah, I was double timing, and I know. And you know what?
And a thief.
I was 18 years old. So
you're a thief and a double timer.
Yeah. Thief and a double timer.
All right.
So one day,
and incorrigible.
Right, and incorrigible. Mm-hmm. So one day, I go to the park, and Linda's not there. So I'm heading back to my car. I see Cassie Riley. I say, "Hey, have you seen Linda?" She goes, "Yeah, she's at the basketball court." So we go back towards the basketball court. She's not there. I leave, go back to my car and take off. I'm out of my car maybe 8 minutes, 11 minutes, tops. And I go to Livermore. The next day, when I get back in my car and pull off, there's a cop parked behind my car taking my license plate number down, which I did not see when I got in my car. As I pull away, she pulls up behind me and starts following me down the street. She's calling dispatch. 5:36. I'm following this car, blue Lincoln Continental, and occupied one time. She fixes the time I left the park. She fixes the time that my car leaves, and I head off to Livermore. She pulls around, goes the other. I'm going down this horseshoe type street that's got houses in the middle of the horseshoe, and she goes around. She goes the other way, and we pass each other. And I'm thinking, oh shit, right? And she sees me mouth those words. Because I just got the car, I don't have insurance, I don't have registration. If she stops me, and I don't have a driver's license, and if she stops me, she's going to take my car and they're going to tow it away, and I'm not going to be able to get it. I can't afford. I just bought this car from one of the guys that worked at the company, so it rattled me, and so it turns out that somebody in a similar car, not that car, another car, they find out later, had shot at a police officer, a police chief in Union City, from a powder blue Lincoln Continental, a few years older than mine. And so when she pulled over and took my license plate, she was just running a make on the car. So I'm rattled now because she's gone. Where is she at? Are they going to come take my car? Turns out that in the course of following me, she got a call for an armed robbery and she left. But what was important about that is she set the time that I had left the park. Right. So I go on to Livermore. The next day, it's all over the paper that Cassie Riley was found murdered in the park. Somebody murdered her. It seemed to be a physical assault, a beating, and a drowning. Maybe some manual strangulation was involved. Somebody was really upset with this person. Two things we found out later was that after I had left, maybe an hour or so after that, she had an argument with a guy about a rumor that he was spreading about her having relations with somebody down in the creek area where all the kids hang out and smoke. Mm-hmm. And so she slapped him in his face, and he was very upset. But she had also broke up with her boyfriend, who was on the football team, and she was seeing this African-American kid. And in the 70s, in 74, that was like big news. And he was really upset. Everybody knew that he was mad. I mean, mad to the point of that they were just waiting to see what was going to happen when he got to the park that day. Turns out she shows up dead the next day. No rape. No, this wasn't, the book is very clear, and the criminalist was very clear that whoever did this was not a sexual deviant. Whoever did this was somebody who was enraged with the person. So we're thinking at that time, it's either the guy that she slapped or her boyfriend. We don't know. But the several weeks later, when they're looking for clues, they this policewoman says, you know, that day I saw a car there, and I got my notes. So they got the notes, and they put a thing in the newspaper saying anybody that knows anybody that's driving this kind of car, wearing a uniform, maybe a material witness in a crime, contact us. So my sister ends up contacting the newspaper or the police and saying, yeah, I think that's my brother. You know, he knows something, he doesn't even know it. So they come to the house and serve her with a warrant. My mother's in the hospital. So they served this 14-year-old girl with a warrant, search our house. And on the back porch is a pair of muddy shoes for my uniform. And they confidently said, has he ever come home wet and muddy? She goes, yeah, on more than one occasion. Oh, well, so they put a arrest warrant out on me. And they look into my background. They say, this guy's juvenile history reads like Al Capone. And I've already explained how all I did was run away when I was a kid. I ran away. And, but in the course of being in that boys' home, my file shows that I was suspected in any number of crimes. And it looked really bad. The cops go, this is the guy right here. This is the guy. He was seen talking to the victim at the park, but so was 100 other people, right? So up to this point, what do we have? We have the fact that I was at the park, I never denied. The fact that I had talked to the victim, I never denied that. And now they have a pair of muddy shoes. The flaw in that theory is that the shoes were flat-bottom dress shoes that went with my uniform. The person that killed Cassie Riley was wearing Converse All-Stars. And the footprints at the scene show that the victim struggled with, in a protracted struggle, with this person wearing these other tennis shoes. They showed her tennis shoe prints on top of and underneath these other shoes. So for their theory to work, it would have to mean that I had levitated over the ground and killed this person without touching the ground. I wasn't worried about the shoes that they had because they had nothing to do with the crime scene. I went to the park, which you access through a trail that went alongside the road. Right, it was a shortcut all the kids took to the park. To get down to the murder scene, you would have to leave the trail, go down this long path that went down to the creek. It was very steep. You almost had to slide down there. But kids would go down there because it was shielded from the houses and parents couldn't see them smoking. So everybody was always down there smoking or whatever. And so that's where they found the body. My footprints were nowhere near the body, nowhere in the crime scene. And the fact is I was seen when I left by not only a police officer, but I was seen by these elderly sisters, spinsters that lived across the street. They were doing gardening work, and they saw me get in my car. And they said, yeah, we remember that young man. They said, well, was he wet? No, he wasn't wet. He was not wet. Like I said, I was out of the car maybe 8 to 11 minutes. I went to Livermore. Somehow they took those muddy shoes, sat them on a table during the trial, and talked about how I had went that day, seen talking to the victim, heading to the park, and killed the victim and left the victim there. The evidence that was ignored in this was the fact that she was seen alive by one of her best friends who was out collecting money for newspapers long after 6:30. Closer to 7, she was heading towards the store. I was already in Livermore. I'd left at 5:36. At 7 o'clock, around 7 o'clock, this couple named Huntoon heard this blood-curdling scream. They thought a child had been run over. They went out in front of their house and looked in the street to see if somebody got hit by a car. They did not know what was going on. They didn't see anything. They went back in. The next morning, the body of Cassie Riley was found 50 feet from their back door in the creek area. They actually pinpointed the time of death because they heard the scream. Again, I was in Livermore. I was gone. I had not been there since 5:36. I was gone. These things, for whatever reason, the jury was just focused on these shoes and the fact that my sister had said that at some point in that month, I had come home wet. She wasn't sure. She said, I'm sure it wasn't the day of the murder. I'm sure it could have been several days before, several days after. I don't know. So they take my sister before the trial. This is an important part of it as well. She is upset and depressed because I was arrested and she felt responsible. So she tried to commit suicide. They take her and put her in juvenile hall. They put her in a room where 24/7 there's this light that's on, and there's a camera in there that watches her every second that she's in that cell. She's 14 years old. She has to do her hygiene and her woman things. She has to do the things that she needs to do under the watchful eye of this camera. They come to her one night and they say, "We're going to move you because we think somebody in your family is going to have you killed. So we're going to move you." They take her at night in a van to the home of the district attorney's investigator, and they have her live with him and his family for 4 months before she testified.
And by the way, they've admitted to all this.
They have admitted to all this.
This is on record.
Yeah, we found this out later,
it's public,
though.
Yes.
Yeah, we found this out later, which is one of the things the Innocence Project was able to find. But
even if you're guilty, that's clearly improper.
Exactly.
Right.
So during the course of her staying at this house, they talk to her every day about what she remembers and how she remembers it. And she in later years, she believes that those conversations changed her recollection of a lot of things. She never said that I was guilty of anything. She never said that I came home and said, "Oh, I killed somebody," or any of that. She said she remembers that I was wet at some point, which happened several times. And she said, even in the documentary that they did, she said, "I told him, yes, he's come home wet on more than one occasion." So unless I went back several times and did it every time, so I was so sure that I was going to walk out of court. My public defender, who, by the way, I was his first murder case, my public defender asked me to cut my hair, which was kind of odd because he had a ponytail down the middle of his back. And he wanted me to cut my hair, and I wouldn't cut it because I was sure the trial was going to be over in a few weeks, and I didn't want to cut the hair that the girls liked. I mean, I had a lot of hair then. And so I didn't cut my hair. And that's how sure I was. When I was found guilty, I could not believe it. I felt eviscerated. I couldn't believe it. You would think that the one thing that they need to convict somebody of murder is some evidence that he did it. And so I've explained how the shoes got muddy. Even if I couldn't explain how the shoes got muddy, they had nothing to do with the crime because the footprints did not come from those shoes. Those shoes that they had sitting in front of the jury they had no connection to anything that was at the crime scene. The prosecutor at the trial, right at the very beginning, brought in this big doctor's bag. He opens it up and he pulls out this puzzle piece and he says, "Let me tell you exactly how this fits together and see if you can get a picture of what happened." And he starts putting up these puzzle pieces, these huge puzzle pieces on this magnetic board that he had wheeled in. And as he's talking, he's putting these pieces up. When he's done, it's a huge wall-size picture of the body of Cassie Riley. Just a horrendous, shocking picture. And it stayed there every day. He would refer to something in that picture, and it stayed there as part of the backdrop that these jurors were greeted with every day. They needed somebody to pay for that crime, and they had somebody. And they wanted me to, I wanted to testify and tell them exactly what I'm saying right now. But the judge ruled that if I got on the stand and said what I'm saying right now, that the district attorney would be allowed to question me about my juvenile file. I would be opening the door for that. And so my public defender says, you can't get up there because they're going to ask you about all this crap. And the jury's going to go, just like the cops did. Yeah, he did it. Yeah, he's got this history, is this background. And so I ended up just, waiting for the verdict. And I was confident, like I said, that it was going to be all fine, because what did they have? What did they show? It didn't work out that way. I ended up going to prison. And like I said, I immediately went to the law stacks, and I was there every day, practically for 41 years. I was in the law library every day, and I went there to try and figure out, how did this happen? And the more I read in the law, the more I realized this shouldn't be happening. This is not how the law works.
So here's what I don't understand. So it sounds like there were other potential suspects.
There were. They withheld them from us.
Why then would the police and prosecutors want you to be the perpetrator?
Well, I was both smart and mouthy, and the cops hated me. I didn't like them very much either. I was in my.
I was going to say nice Jewish boy, but not so nice Jewish boy.
No, right? No, I was a thorn in their side.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I'd already at that point developed a political identity, fist in the air kind of thing, and I was dealing with a couple of things as well. I got the job as a security guard because it was available, and I was able to start right away. And my mother was not in the household. She was in the hospital, and I needed money to feed my sisters. So I took the job, but I didn't like the fact that I was carrying a gun, and that I was wearing a badge, and that I was standing. And one of the things that they contracted us for, we went to a school dance, and our job was to keep the gang members out of the parking lot during the dance, which was code for the Mexicans could not come. So they had us out there telling people that they couldn't come into the parking lot area. And some of these people were students at the school. And so I was really conflicted about this new job that I had. And I really turned it up with the cops to let them know I'm not one of you. And so don't think of me as one of you. This is what I'm doing. And they hated me. They really hated me because I was always involving myself in stuff that was none of my business.
Like what?
Well, we would cruise, and the cops would always show up and harass people. And I would always get involved. So what's the problem? What were they doing, And it's none of your business. Stay out of it. And it always ended up turning back on me. But I stuck my nose in their business all the time.
So who do you think did it?
Well, one of the guys, the guy that she slapped, he's in the joint now for another crime, but he's a registered sex offender, and he had some really weird shit he was doing back then. At the time of her murder, the police reports that we ended up getting later showed that people were pointing at him saying, this guy made the statement that she thinks she's better than everybody else. She needs, whatever. This is what she needs. She needs a man, and then she'll know. And these are kids talking, right? He was exposing himself on the bus to other students.
We're talking about a teenager. This boy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he was like 14 years. He was 14. Yeah, he was exposing himself to, and he was grabbing girls' breasts, at the park, and unwanted. This was before the Me Too movement, but I mean, he was probably the cause of a lot of trauma for some of these young girls. But that's one suspect. The other one was her boyfriend that she cut loose. And there's another guy. The guy in the book, the
book is
Hunting Evil by Carlton Smith. Carlton Smith was writing about a crime that James DiVeggio had committed. He kidnapped a woman in Pleasanton, and him and his girlfriend, whose van they had turned into a torture van, kidnapped this young woman in Pleasanton and took her all the way to Lake Tahoe, torturing her with curling irons and other things, raping her, and then killed her and left her in a snowbank there. James DiVeggio is the young man who she broke up with, and who sister said at the time of the investigation of Cassie Riley's murder, said that he had snuck out of the house that night and buried, that his mother had lied to the police that he was not in the house, that he did not leave the house that day of the murder, which was not true. Years later, Michelle Mashad said that who she met 27 years after Cassie Riley's murder, she met him and assisted him in kidnapping and raping and other things. But she said he took her to the scene of the crime of Cassie Riley's murder and said, "This is the one I feel most guilty about," and told her that he had snuck out of the house and buried his tennis shoes, his Converse All-Stars, by a tree, which now has a subdivision on it. But
okay, so James DiVeggio, who I think is identified by the author of that book as, the author argues that DiVeggio did this.
That's what he believes, right?
Yeah. And so, but am I right that DiVeggio was 14 years old at the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
But they called him Froggy. They called him Froggy because he had this really deep voice. He was a huge guy.
Right.
I mean, he was as big as any adult. And they called him Froggy. He had these big hands, and he had this deep voice. James DiVeggio was a linebacker for the high school football team.
So he's different than the registered sex offender?
Right. He's a different guy.
But that guy also was 14.
Yes.
Okay. So there's two 14-year-olds here who are potential suspects, but then you were 18.
Right.
Right. And you were, I assume, fully grown?
Yeah.
Essentially. And
right.
Probably, a man's size and with a man's strength. So I would imagine that's, not in your favor, right?
No, it wasn't in my favor. But still, you would have to prove that somehow or other I was there.
It's still circumstantial.
Right.
Sure. But I mean, okay. Well, I don't know. Marvin, I don't know what to do. I'm thinking now it may be irrelevant.
It is, to the extent that my life being impacted by it. It's not irrelevant to Cassie Riley or her family.
No, I mean,
right.
To me, how I should think about you.
Right. Well, her family are almost all gone. A representative from the family came to my parole hearing, had written 3 letters beforehand saying, "Look, we've read the transcripts, we've investigated the case, we've seen all the information. We don't believe that he committed this crime. And from what we know from the people that knew Cassie, we believe it's this person or this person." They came to my hearing and testified that they cannot move on because I'm still in prison. They don't believe I'm guilty and that I should be released. And it was really a critical point in that board hearing. That, along with the letter from the district attorney's office that said, "I have remembered this case many times over the years and found I have more doubts about this conviction than any other."
Right. The prosecutor in the case has publicly said this. Yes.
Yeah, and he alluded to the fact. He says in the letter, "Myself and other people in the district attorney's office did many things to preserve the testimony of his sister." Only people that know the backstory knows the significance of that sentence right there. My sister and I have never blamed my sister for anything that happened to me, and I have never allowed her to believe for 1 second that I hold any animosity against her. We have a great relationship. We had like Thanksgiving dinner over at her house, and so I don't know. I think going forward, there is a continuum in our experiences. I think things happen for a reason, and for some reason, I was meant to see the inside of that system for 40 years, and who knows what's going to happen from that intimacy. I spoke at the Jewish Community Center. I opened up a pre-event for Brian Stevenson. He did a book called Just Mercy. And one of the things that he says is that in order to fix brokenness, you have to become proximal to it. You can't do it remotely. You can't do those Star Trek scans and figure shit out. And I don't know that you can become any more proximal than being inside that prison system. And it is broken. And when I walked out the front gate, when you first go into prison, there's this long protracted period of blindness. You're groping around, you're trying to get your bearings in this dark place. And pretty soon your eyes become acclimated to the darkness. You start seeing. And once I got acclimated to the darkness, I saw that the place was a minefield of these bodies of broken lives. It's just, and for 40 years, they were asking, did I take this journey with them and help them fix things? They didn't know how. And so I became that person that tried to fix things and became the voice for a lot of the things that needed to be fixed. And when I walked out of prison, I found that there's a second period of blindness. When you leave the dark and come back to the light, you're blind again. You cannot see, you're groping around. But along with that was this feeling that I'm no longer who I was. When the gate closed behind me, I felt that all that I'd become and all that I've done and all that I aspired to be was locked inside that prison. And I was standing out there naked again. I remember thinking when I walked into prison that I was standing there with no tools and no weapons to fight a system that had engulfed me. And I felt I was naked against the aggression of the system. I felt that same thing again. I felt when I was outside the gate that I had been disarmed once more, and I was no longer this person. And another strange psychology that I still suffer from is I feel ashamed, guilty that I'm out here, and there's still people inside that I knew and still know. There's guys in there I love them. And it's hard to understand how for 40 years it's not okay to leave, and then all of a sudden one day it's okay to leave. And why it's okay for me to leave and other guys not to leave. To me, that's the biggest injustice, is that you have this arbitrary manner in which you decide who's worthy and who isn't. There's nothing connected to it that's of any substance. It's just one day you're the guy who was chosen, and you get to go. And I'm not okay with that. Even though I'm free, I'm not okay with it. And so one of the things I'm working on right now is to try and get a lawmaker, and I have two that are interested in forming legislation to get rid of the last bit of this indeterminate sentencing. Not in 1974, you had the Enrique Rodriguez case.
So you were sentenced to 7 years to life, which was typical then.
Right.
Now it's more determinate, right? So it was really the reason you were in for 40 years was that the parole board would just determine on a regular basis whether you should continue to stay after the 7 years.
Exactly.
Right? And they just kept saying, and you did it 21 times, is that right?
You went 22 times.
22 times you went to the board and asked, and they said no until the very end. And so that's what you're getting at here.
Exactly.
It's
well,
and arbitrary. And it's up to these individuals with particular interests, whether you go free or not.
Well, the way the law was supposed to work, indeterminate sentencing in 1914, it became effective 1917, was supposed to be this beneficent law. It was supposed to be ameliorative. People were doing so much time. They said, listen, we need to stop the judges from giving these guys this time. Every crime from petty theft to murder was now indeterminate. It was 6 months to life, 1 year to life, 5 years to life, 7 to life. And the theory was that once you went, you would be evaluated by this panel that the warden of each facility would put together and determine what amount of time, if any, you had left to do. And it was supposed to be based on your personal culpability in the crime, the facts of the crime, your personal culpability.
Whether you admitted to it.
Yeah.
Took responsibility for it. You, Marvin, never did. Right.
That
was your problem, wasn't it?
It was my problem.
And that's why they kept denying you.
Exactly. And then they were supposed to look at your in-prison conduct and your programming and determine whether you have grown as a man enough to where you could go out and become productive in society. That's not what happened. What happened was these panels, once you gave them the power, the exclusive power as an executive arm, of the executive branch of government, they now had this quasi-judicial power to determine punishment, which is a legislative act. I think it's a violation of the separation of powers personally, but they're making this determination how much punishment you get. And that's being challenged. I was just at the Supreme Court 2 weeks ago with the team. We wrote an amicus on the Butler case, and we appeared at the Supreme Court of California in support of that amicus to make just that argument. Look, you really have to decide whether this is a violation of separation of powers and whether it's constitutional to allow the executive branch of government to decide punishment. But the way it was supposed to work is that they were supposed to look at your personal culpability in your crime. They had a matrix. Back then it topped out at 18 years. And they would say, okay, didn't know the victim, committed the crime during a robbery. In the matrix, that's 11 years. That's your term. Once they set your term, that's the upper end. That's the day that they have to let you go. They have a limited discretion in placing you in the matrix, followed by a full discretion to let you out earlier than that, saying, okay, you have 11 years, but
it's a mandatory maximum.
Right. Yeah. So now that you've been doing so good in here and you got yourself a trade, you got your high school diploma, you know what? We're going to take 2 years off of that. We're going to let you out in 9. Come back next year with some more program. We might take off some more. So that's how it was supposed to work. It didn't work out that way. They immediately stopped setting what was later to be called primary terms, meaning they stopped looking at that matrix and saying, this is your time. They said, we're going to set your time once we find you suitable. Meaning once we find that you're no longer a danger, we're going to set your time, which now fully actualized the act that I was telling you about, that they are determining punishment. Because the longer that they delayed setting your term, the longer you sat in prison, and it increased your punishment every year. So they would tell me every year, look, you need to admit and accept responsibility. If you don't do that, we don't have any confidence that you are not still dangerous. So after about 15 times of hearing that, I finally thought to myself, what does it matter? I'm in prison. I'm doing life. What does it matter? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm responsible. Like, when do I get out? Well, can't let you out now. You're a big liar. You just admitted you've been lying to us. So you're a liar.
What did you lie about?
Well, because I said I was innocent. And when I went, at one point I said, okay, I'm accepting responsibility.
And you made up a story, right?
I did. I made up a story. I made up a story that was so fantastical that later I would have deniability.
What was the story?
I said I was part of a racist youth group that took umbrage with the fact that she was dating outside her race, and we built this elaborate mechanism to dunk her in the water and to tell us so she could tell us where this guy lived and all that. It was pure nonsense, but it was nonsense to the extent that later I could say, look, I'm Jewish, first of all. Second of all, really, we built a dunking stool? I mean, who believes that?
Right.
But midway through that story, the commissioner said, why are you lying to us? I said, because you said, if I don't tell you, I'm taking responsibility, that I wouldn't get out. So I said I'd take responsibility. Then you said, oh, tell us how you did it. Mm-hmm. So I had to make up this story. And I had to make up a story that was not going to make me seem like some kind of monster. It's the worst thing, the worst decision, the worst, bar none, it's the worst thing I've ever done to myself. That cost me another 10 years. That 15 minutes of storytelling cost me 10 more years. And needless to say, it wasn't until 2000 when Carlton Smith was doing his book and he found all of this exculpatory evidence. He contacted my public defender from so many years ago and said, I have this stuff that you should see. I think this guy committed the crime that your client went to prison for. So he came up somewhere with all of these police reports and other things that we had never seen. Carlton Smith and some paperwork that I found, one of the counselors and one of the prisons I was in did not like the crime that I was in prison on. So she wrote to the police department and said, please send us any information and paperwork you have on this crime so we can keep Mr. Mutch for as long as we can. So they sent her 3 huge files of copies of paperwork, right? One day I'm doing what's called an Olson review, getting ready for board. And usually they bring me down this file, fairly thick file, that I can go through. I'm allowed to look at the contents of my central file, which is the record of my entire incarceration, to see if there's anything in there I need to defend myself on at the board. It's a court decision. So I'm going for my Olson review, and this time the person brought me a box with 5 files in it. I said, what is this? They said, I don't know, it's got your name on it. So I look, and it's these files that they've had for years that they never showed me. And so I'm going through it, and I'm telling this new person, hey, I need copies of all this. So they made me copies of everything, and I sent it out to Carlton Smith. He showed it to James McWilliams, and he said...
Who was your lawyer?
Right.
Okay.
He was my public defender. And James McWilliams said, I have not seen 75% of this.
Wow.
75% of it they had not seen. Had we had this paperwork at the time of my trial, I would have not been convicted. And you hear about these cases all the time where they withhold things. They withheld most of their investigation from my attorney. And they withheld my sister from my attorney. My public defender wanted to interview Valerie about what she exactly said when they came to the house. And he was never able to do it because they wouldn't tell him where she was. She was being housed with the district attorney's investigator, which is something they did not want out during the trial.
I'm sure.
And so I'm not sure what it is that runs through me when I talk about this, because on one hand, you're sorely aware when you're in these hearings that you're talking about somebody who died. So there was a death here. And so to me, that matters. And there are people that say, well, you know what, if, you think about it, you don't have any responsibility, so you shouldn't have any emotion about it. But, for 41 years, I was defined by my conviction. Every time somebody opened a file, every time somebody talked to me in any official capacity, for any reason, right down to the medical doctors that saw you over the course of your lifetime in there, you are defined by what they see in that file. You are that. And I've had to live with the shame of being that. Having somebody look up from your file and look at you like, you did this? Mm-hmm. And so it comes with the environment causes you to absorb these types of things. I didn't consciously say, I'm really ashamed of this crime, because shame invokes the image that you did something to be ashamed of. But it's really odd that it came to me that I felt shame when people looked at me. It's like, because you realize they believe you did this. Yeah. And so I am intimate with this crime. This crime is something I lived with for 41 years, and I carried with me as a companion every moment that I was conscious, and so I have extreme empathy for the family of the victim, and I have extreme empathy for the people who have been washed over by the ripples of this crime. And so that empathy also amplifies the feeling that I had inside. I don't have it that much anymore out here as far as, my day-to-day interactions with people. I don't worry that they are looking at me this way. It was inside that you had to really, and that was complicated as well, because it turns out my advocacy elevated me to a level of necessity for a lot of people. I was doing legal work for people and stuff, but normally people who have this type of a crime do not fare well in prison. But early on, they had a lot of articles that talked about my innocence, and it was easy for the shot callers that made the kind of decisions say, well, you know what, this guy is, he's doing a lot for us. And plus, these people said that he didn't do it, right? And so in that respect, I was lucky, because it's really not an altruistic environment that you're in prison. And so in that respect, I was lucky. And when I came out here, I have an opportunity now to finish what I started inside. And it's allowed me to, I'm doing some contract work right now. We're working on putting together some housing options for people coming out of the penitentiary. And I'm doing lobby work. We're working on legislation. I lobbied on the Youth Offender Acts. And like I said, we were in the Supreme Court on some other issues with the parole board. And so I'm slowly building my platform back out here, because really my platform was inside. And what was effective about what I did was the fact that it was being done from inside. And I had a personal stake in it. But out here, I think I kicked on the wall hard enough and long enough inside that I can push it over from this side. And that's going to be done with, the full help and cooperation of people, progressives that are in the California legislature or one of those avenues. The fact is that I think the time is long past, or has been long past, for revolution, unless, of course, we change the definition of what that revolution is. And I think we can still have a revolution. It just doesn't have to be the one that ends with bodies crushed and crashed in the streets. I think we can do it in another way. And I've always felt that.
Well, I hope it happens.
I do too.
And I want to thank you for talking to me. I want to thank you for telling me the story. And I'm still struggling with what I should think.
Right.
But I do know that I'm on your side in that
Right.
revolution.
Right. Well, the fact that you're struggling with what to think exposes the injustice of what happened so many years ago. Because when you, as a society, when you as a community take the action to remove somebody and place them in that cave for years and decades, you cannot have the luxury of being ambiguous about it. At the end, those people who have this sanction placed against them, it has to be underpinned by certainty, which is why beyond a reasonable doubt is the level of proof that's required in court. We didn't get anywhere near that in this trial. And whether you believe in me or not, you have to believe that the system, as flawed as it is all that we have, and maybe the framers that came up with this whole thing, we need to go back and examine exactly what their intent was and how it was supposed to work, because it's not happening now. And the fact that you don't know what to think validates.
Right. Exactly. I should know.
I'm saying, yeah,
right. Exactly.
You should know.
Yeah.
It's something that I would say is, as a society, as a sentient society, it's something that we should want.
Yeah.
Because the old adage about they came for these people and nobody was there, and it could be anybody next. And we're at a time right now that who knows, what they're going to come after next. It could be unregistered podcasts or something.
Oh, I'm definitely next. Well, again, thank you, Marvin. This has been wonderful, and best of luck to you. And as I said, I am on your side in this for sure. Mm-hmm. Thanks very much.
This was the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To sign up for the Renegade University webinars, visit thaddeusrussell.com/courses. To support the show and become a member of the Unregistered community, go to unregisteredlisteners.com. Thanks for listening.